if all the participants are here, we can start the session.
I'm there.
Yeah, I have the second one. Hi, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Am I the first person?
The schedule says that I'm the fourth, right? And you're right before me.
Yeah, the first speaker is Dr. P. Samatha. I don't know whether she is there or not.
Go ahead, Pragya.
Okay, sir.
Do we have Dr. P. Samatha here?
Welcome back post the lunch, and I hope we are all able to keep ourselves awake and alert for this session as it is post the lunch. This session is being chaired by Dr. Sanjay Kumar, who has been teaching French literature at Department of French and Francophone Studies, EFLU Hyderabad, for about 12 years now. He has a doctorate in Swiss French literature from JNU Delhi. Dr. Kumar has supervised 3 PhD theses so far. Besides, he has presented more than 20 papers in different national and international conferences. He has published 9 books and around 20 research articles in French, English, and Hindi. His French grammar book is taught across schools, in several schools and colleges across the country. He has also translated 3 French novels into Hindi, including Patrick Modiano's Nobel Prize winner to 2014. Dr. Sanjay Kumar's translation was nominated for Romain Rolland Prize 2021, which is given to the best translation. Welcome, Dr. Sanjay, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Pragya, for this nice introduction. And dear professors, research scholars, colleagues, and all the participants, good afternoon, and welcome to this second session, afternoon session here. So as per the schedule, we have 4 speakers. Dr. P. Samta is supposed to be the first speaker. Then we have Dr. Sanju Thomas. Then Dr. Atmadeep and Madhuri Krishna. Then we have Dr. Tonisha Goi. So we have these 4 speakers, and in order of appearance, then it should be Dr. P. Samta, the first one. Dr. P. Samta, are you present here?
Prajna, is she here?
I think she was here, yeah. Let me just message her.
Okay. In that case, I think we should go to the next speakers, the Dr. Sanju Thomas. Shall we?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So now we have, as per the schedule, the second speaker, but since the first speaker is not present, so we will have the presentation from Dr. Sanju Thomas. She is an assistant professor at Ambedkar University, Delhi. And the title of her paper is the Tide Turning? Indian Literature in Translation as Indian Literature. So I invite Dr. Sanju Thomas to present her paper. Over to you.
Yeah. Okay. So am I audible?
Yes, yes, very much.
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be part of this translation conference. Looking at the variety of topics of the papers, I think it's going to be a very enriching experience for all of us. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. My paper is titled, Is the Tide Turning? I've made a slight change in the title. I've named it, Is the Tide Turning? Indian English Fiction and English Translations of Bhasha Fiction. So the question remains the same, but I'll be looking at both these branches of Indian literature to discuss the question I have put in the title. So needless to say, it's a working paper, and I hope there'll be more clarity on the topic after more discussion and research. So let me try and present a short PPT here. Is it visible?
Yes, it is visible.
All right. Okay. So let me just start with the paper. Is the Tide Turning? Indian English Fiction and English Translation of Bhasha Fiction. The tussle between Indian English writing and Bhasha literatures has been a long-standing one. While the debates range from authenticity to colonial baggage to privilege, the equation between Indian English literature or fiction and English translation of Bhasha literatures or fiction has been very curious. Meenakshi Mukherjee, in her article, Divided by the Same Language, problematized the strange phenomenon of the disparity in the success of Indian writing in English and Indian literature in English translation. Considering that a lot of Indian literature is being translated into English, she wonders about the 2 numerically comparable sets, Indian novels written in English and Indian novels translated into English, and the asymmetry in their reception. the bulk of Indian literature still is accessible to the West only through translations. Still, despite the centrality of translation in the accessibility, acceptability, and celebration of a piece of writing, whether fiction, poetry, or history, translation from Indian languages into English has remained, till very recently, a severely constrained project. But this seems to have changed in the new millennium. This is evident from more and more publishing houses getting involved in bringing out translations, constitution of new literary prizes for translated literature from India finding a place in the long list and short list of international awards, and they're figuring in almost every list of Indian newspapers and magazines that bring out year-end best lists. Is translation in India getting its due share of glory now in India and abroad? What changed from the 1940s and 50s to the second decade of the 2000s that the tables almost seem to have turned with regard to Indian English literature and Indian literature in English translation? So in my paper, I propose to look at this resurgence of translations in an attempt to decode why Indian literature finally resembles Indian literature in English translation. What is Indian literature itself is a question that scholars have not found an answer to. The usage now is increasingly literatures of India, which stresses on the plurality and negates the idea of one single monolithic unit. Therefore, the very idea of representing such a literature to the world is a difficult idea, especially when that representation happens to be in English, with which India has a complicated relationship. While steering clear of this complexity, the attempts of the early leaders of a newly independent India was to showcase a single nation with a common past and a shared dream. A representative literature was imperative to project this idea. However, as Rosemary Marangoli substantiates, the Sahitya Academy projects betrayed a plurality that could not many times be channeled into a singular idea of Indian literature. Even when English is not in the scheduled list of languages, it has remained the lingua franca, and representations of Indian literature to the world invariably had to be in English translations. Though there were ambitious projects of translating amongst the bhashas, this came to become a more of a minor activity compared to the translations from bhashas to English. However, the reception of English translations remained tepid as bhasha literatures remained rooted in their locales. Indian English fiction, too, could not claim a large base of readers. The language of these writers, R.K. Narayan, Mulkraj Anand, Raja Rao, and so on, continued to be in an acquired tongue, the feel of it very much that of a translated text. G.J.V. Prasad, in his writing translation, The Strange Case of Indian English Novel, points out that Indian English writing is created by translation and assimilation and transformation of the Indian text, context, and English language. This has been further reiterated by many other scholars. Sujit Mukherjee comments that Indian English fiction was a companion to translations, and that is how it mostly remained till Rushdie broke into the scene. I need to change the slide just a second. Okay, I'll just stop share. I'll just read. Sorry. So it was practically in the 1980s, or rather specifically with the publication of Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie and the Booker Prize that came for it, that Indian English fiction soared to newer heights. Indian English fiction, which was still then an ugly duckling, even among the works of fiction of Indian languages, suddenly transformed into an attractive golden swan, demanding attention from global publishers and critics, and inspiring a new breed of writers driven to write in English for the fame and money that the international publishing industry promised. Midnight Children started a new epoch in Indian English fiction and has more or less changed what the world considers Indian literature to be. The novel signals a change from the earlier Indian English fiction, whose concerns were as local as any work in an Indian language was. With Midnight Children, the concerns became global multiculturalism came into vogue, and Indian history became a reservoir of countless narratives and counter-narratives. Still, scholars like Asaduddin have felt that the 90s saw a translation boom in India, with more and more publishing houses turning to translations from Bhashas to English. However, Indian English fiction marched ahead with the likes of Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai, Aravind Adiga, Amitav Ghosh, bringing international attention and prizes. The narratives of all these novels, except maybe that of Ghosh, are sweeping statements about India in the line of Midnight Children. Many of them are located in urban spaces and offer a glimpse of the underbelly of these places, but also comment on villages as places of ignorance, breeding inequality and crime. But from the latter half of the last decade, one can see a different trend in the case of Indian English fiction. It looks like there is no longer the need to write back to the empire, insisting that the decolonization drive is on. The concerns of Indian English writers have shifted from representing the idea of Indianness to matters closer to home. Take, for example, the novels of Anis Salim. The context of the novel are highly localized. The characters are inward looking. Any Malayali who would read The Small Town Sea would be able to relate to the landscape and the sensibility the novel has managed to capture. Anjum Hassan's novels are tied to Shillong, her hometown. Amit Chaudhary, Anuradha Roy, Eastern Perry, Jahnavi Barua all talk about smaller milieux, personal stories, and local histories which are necessary to be told. There is no eagerness to pepper English with any Indian language. The bilingualism, if at all, is a natural choice. Bhasha writers, on the other hand, were considered to be regional or even parochial. The very term regional has a restrictive sense to it, but this has been the biggest argument against Bhasha writers. However, one of the changes that has happened in the last decade is that Bhasha writers have become less local, or at least these are the kind of works that get translated and get a good reception. For example, consider a novella like Khachar Khochar. This Kannada novel, a thriller set in Bangalore, converses with the Indian middle class caught up in the race for inching up the economic ladder at any cost. It's a novella that retains but also surpasses the regional sensibility to connect with every reader. K.R. Meera's much celebrated novel, Arachar, translated as The Hanged Woman by J. Devika, has a singular theme from a feminist perspective, and the setting is Bengal. Benjamin is another Malayali writer who gets translated, and his stories too, through a Malayali diasporic protagonist, talk about universal topical themes of migration, displacement, and survival. Indu Menon's short stories, translated as The Lesbian Cow and Other Stories, shock you with their treatment and their universal appeal. Her stories are not rooted in Kerala, they're scattered all over the subcontinent. Another novel that spans centuries and countries is Sugandhi alias Andal Devanayagi by T.D. Ramakrishnan, translated by Priya K. Nair. Sarah Joseph's latest novel, Buddhini, talks about the plight of the Sandal girl Buddhini, and through her, many others who like her, whose lives have get trampled upon in the name of development. Yes, Harish's Misha or Mustache could be one exception. This novel, spanning across centuries, reads like a fantasy novel and is woven like an oral narrative with stories within stories. The novel is deeply rooted in the socio-political context of Kerala and challenges the accepted history of the land. The newness of the narrative itself lends it an aura of grandeur, but that grandeur itself is subversive. One might assume that these aspects about the novel marks it as different and therefore one that needs to be translated. Jayashree Kalathil, the translator, felt that the book is written in a non-linear folksy way with several voices and tones. This was actually, she says, very enabling for me as a translator because it gave me a lot of latitude. She also talks about how she was in constant touch with the author all through these 11 months that she took to translate the book. This is another important change that has come in with regard to translation. There was a time when translation was considered to be a tug of war of power between authors and translators. Rangarao called it the translation trauma. Authors believed that their works were deliberately getting misinterpreted and misrepresented, while translators thought that they were not getting appreciated for their effort and creativity. The term translators invisibility is familiar to us all. In an interview, the writer of Khachar Khochar, Vivek Shanbag, and Sriram Perur, the translator, had talked about their collaborative process, which the author describes as more of a process of dismantling and rebuilding. Thus, as Nicole Brozard would put it, as mentioned by Barbara Goddard, translation many times reveals more than it hides. Schanbach comments how the discussions made him aware of his strengths and weaknesses as a writer. E.B. Fatima and Nandagumar, who translated M. Mugundan's Delhi soliloquy, have observed how their translation techniques were different, but how they still collaborated with success. These are translators who are aware of their craft and role and can reflect on the process of creation and recreation, and this has immensely helped the case of translations in India. Translation thus becomes a collaborative authorship, with both writer and translator having equal stakes. In a 2008 interview, Geeta Krishnankuti, who won Katha Awards and Crossword Prize for Translation, opined when asked about the impact of her translations. I don't know what it makes, that much difference. Translations are not selling well anyway, and I don't have much hope on that score. They say it's changing, but as far as we are concerned, I look for my books in bookshops and I don't see them. While one cannot vouch for the fact that translations are selling well, one does spot more translations in bookshops now. More than that, translators are given a platform to speak in various social media and literature festivals. E.V. Fatima is in one such occasion, spoke about how she was then booked for almost 1 year. The books mentioned above have been translated by different translators, and all of them have been interviewed by YouTube channels, newspapers, online portals, and so on. So this creates again an awareness about translation itself and brings the spotlight on translators. Money was another constricting factor when it comes to translation. It always used to be a labor of love and nothing else. Now, monetarily, it still remains a much limited project, but still, this also has improved with the setting up of awards such as the JCB Literary Prize, which is given every year for the best Indian fiction. The Crossword Book Prize also consider translated works, but they consider translations as a different category. The Hindu Literary Prize and the JCB Prize, treat them together. JCB Prize actually carries a cash award of 25 lakhs and 10 lakhs goes to the translators. The New India Foundation has started giving fellowships to translators of non-fiction work. Now, a work of literature is ultimately a labor of love, indeed, but there is no denying that recognition in the form of awards and fellowships does give a kind of impetus to the creative energy. So the change in the trend is very much visible in the media too. The year-end Best of Indian Fiction lists of various media publications invariably have been featuring translations along with Indian English fiction for the last few years. Daisy Rockwell, who translated Tomb of Stone, says, in India, there is definitely a growing interest in translations and a growing respect for non-English language literatures. She says that she does not know how this happened, but that it is very welcome. Since in post-colonial India, the story of translations and Indian English fiction were always intertwined, one would assume that this change too is because of the other. The establishment of translation studies as a discipline in the West in the late 1970s coincided, unfortunately for translations in India, with the rise of Indian English fiction and Rushdie's Midnight Children. Ironically, in India, it is the decolonization drive that really paved the way for the consolidation of Indian English fiction. However, the obsession with the post-colonial might finally be waning, and as we introspect to grapple with our realities closer to home, we also navigate through this world brought together and swept apart at the same time by the forces of globalization. But more importantly, the shape of post-colonial literature itself might be changing. In fact, translation studies now has a prominent place in post-colonial literature. For example, Dalit literature has come in the ambit of post-colonial literature, and which is mostly available in translation. Thus, Indian literature seems to be poised to make the best of the opportunities that the contemporary socio-political and economic context provide. Sujit Mukherjee, in his decisive work, Translation as Discovery, wrote about two branches of Indian writing in English. He termed translation as Indo-English writing and Indian writing in English as Indo-Anglian writing, and treated both as part of one genre of literature, and seems not to have perceived one as a rival of the other. Even when he is skeptical of the ability of English to capture the nuances of an Indian context, he concludes that English, in inverted commas, I quote, offers the widest area of discovery through and in translation. In fact, he predicts that Indo-English works or translation would serve as a linked literature of India, leading to a wholesome entity that can be called Indian literature. He had even hoped that a Booker Prize for translation was not far away. The translation of Gitanjali Shree's Hindi novel, Tomb of Stone, Great Samadhi, has found a place in the shortlist for the Booker Prize this year. The 2022 International Booker Prize judges termed the novel a loud and irresistible novel, while her translator calls it a love letter to Hindi language. From Rushdie to Sri, the tide definitely seems to be turning. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very clear presentation. And should we have question answer right now or at the end of the?
At the end, I would suggest.
At the end.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So then, as we know that Dr. P. Samta is not present, so we will go to the next speaker. That is the third speaker. So we have Mr. Amandeep and Ms. Madhuri Krishna. So do we have these speakers present here?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this presentation and seminar. I'm going to present a presentation. So will it be fine if I share the screen?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, thank you. So this is a joint presentation, joint paper written by me and Madhuri Krishna. I will be present the entire presentation. The title of this presentation is The Melodious Resistance, a study on the current surge of translation practices of protest songs across different Indian languages. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will be also be singing about the dark times. Bertolt Brecht said in 1939. So when Nietzsche writes with reference to his typewriter that our writing tools also work on our thoughts, it suggests that tools have potential to enframe. Human beings cannot think without tools or outside of them. Tools, in other words, do more than simply serve, and media carriers do more than merely conserve. They are constitutive. Translation without tools simply does not exist. The statement by Michael Cronin is vital for understanding the evolution of translation. He further states, in a properly integrated approach to translation, it is necessary to consider not only the general symbolic system, the specific code, the physical support, the means of transmission, but also how translations are carried through societies over time by particular groups. This idea around translation serves as a key tool to understand the connection between songs and translation. In the last decades of 20th century, nations, communities started redrawing borders more frequently and rapidly than ever. This was both dissolvable and impenetrable. The number of independent states became 196 by 2019, almost double of the number from 1950, which was 100. Those small ethnicities seize opportunities for self-expression, while prosperous countries close their borders to safeguard their territories. Transnational relationships, products, practices, and policies emerged and encouraged the dissolving of both cultural and political borders. Overall, ethnicities achieved more attention, and with increasing importance given to biopolitical production, this recognition depended strongly on social and artistic outputs. Music as a mode of artistic and cultural expression traveled across nations and cultures. Translation practices made it possible. In this regard, globalization was no longer exclusively associated with the binary opposition of vulnerable pluralities and standardized powers. It was considered as generated by the perpetual movement of tensions or conflicts between universal values and particular beliefs, as well as local identities, national interests, and global systems. Music and translation interact constantly because musical texts involving linguistic expression require to be translated in figurative ways. When different aspects of music are transferred or transformed within musical idioms or across different fields of languages, relying on diversity, their interaction not only enlarges the scope of musicology and translation studies but also invites visibility while making communication possible across languages and cultures. The hybridity residing within make translation shape music and indulge music in creating impact on translation. As Aline Ramel remarks, both are positive forces in our global world in that they build and mediate identity, playing a crucial role in our understanding of the cultures we live in and interact with today. Their interaction allows virtual traveling of meaning across borders through words and music. This goes beyond the principle of intersemotic translation introduced by Jacobson, which is based on a form of equivalence between source and target text. It comes under the transformation between entities and content that have commonalities in the age of post-translation studies, as mentioned by Erwin Genzel. Ethnomusicology to understand the songs in translation. Early 20th century musicologists such as Cecil Sharp or Joseph Cantaloupe, or composers like Ralph Vaughan Williams, Louis Janak, Bela Bartok, collected, transcribed, arranged, and promoted thousands of folk songs with the intention of preserving regional and rural music, which they considered threatened. This may be considered as the beginning of ethnomusicology. In India, it was done by many composers, including Rabindranath Tagore. He composed some songs following the Tappa tradition of Shori Miyar Punjabi. The use of folk tunes was also obvious in these tappas. The folk songs of Bengal, Baul, Kirtan, Shyamasangir, Shari, Kotha significantly influenced these songs. Such folk music, the equivalent of pre-industrial popular music, was the expression of a rural local life with which became a thing of the past at the beginning of the 20th century and irrelevant to the modern industrial lifestyles. This passion for collecting songs which used to accompany daily life but had become socially obsolete happened all over Europe and in nations under its colonial rule. Ethnomusicologists emphasize visibly and widely how musicians and composers borrow from across different cultures. As Lipsit highlights, they are committed to multilingualism and cosmopolitanism, which they view as essential to connect people beyond hierarchies and borders. Many ethnomusicologists are keen to consider how different influences have been absorbed, and ethnomusicologists deliberate attempts or unconscious moves to construct musical identities in specific countries. According to Marwan Crady, this implies tight borders between cultures that are intended to be linked, whereas the prefix trans suggests that these cultures can be mixed across space and borders. Music's dependency on variations, fusions, and improvisations guarantee such an inherent mix. Bartok's view on the aesthetic value of this creative translation of what he called peasant music may be perceived as simplistic today, but it gives a sense of expression against colonial and political expression through songs at that time. For instance, Tagore's song collection Baul was vividly used in 1905 during the agitation against the partition of Bengal. As music's social and cultural role in allowing self-discovery and identity building became evident, interest in the music of others also became more prominent. Ethnic music for both composers was deemed essential to the building of musical and political identity. In many respects, they were translating their identity into music for the citizens to wake up, for the world to hear. By 1984, Roger Wallace and Christian Malm had already identified what they named transculturation. In popular music, a two-way process by which local and national musicians incorporate global features of music while contributing to international music development. They termed it is as global music. In this regard, understanding the geographies of translation and music practice and to the mapping of frontiers through translation and music is absolutely essential. For philosophers such as Jacques Attali and Michael Serres, music acts as harbinger of social, political, and economic movements. One salient example of this ability to travel across time and anticipate the future is the contemporary emergence of music genres across continents and all borders. Various hybridizations and fusions of African and Western music establish the foundations of popular music in the world today. The articulation of these transformative movements in music is complex and contradictory. For instance, protest songs based on Anglo-Saxon folk songs emerged in Japan as a new form of singer-songwriting in the late 1960s. They were inspired by a desire to shake the conventional values of Japan, to break its isolationist culture, but were also driven by a need to experiment artistically, both with poetry and music. Individual singer-songwriters used the songs of political activists such as Joe Baez, keeping the spirit of protest of the originals while inscribing them in different artistic continuum and revisiting, mostly subversively, existing Japanese song forms such as enka, a song type popular in Japan in the early 20th century, in order to create a new musical culture meaningful to Japanese people. Similarly, in India, hip hop culture influenced youths and rap gave the momentum to their words. From young prophets to park circus, several individual singers and bands came up with their hip hop music to protest against different socio-political issues. Protest songs have a unique function. Unmasking the naked reality, they explore the imbalance of power between social groups and reflects on social issues as social justice, inequality, environmentalism, and rights of Dalit and indigenous people. They frequently, uh, these songs often penetrate minority viewpoints, those in opposition to prevailing mainstream opinion or government policy. Further, protest songs have proven to be an effective tool for increasing community awareness and stimulating community action in relation to the issues they confront. With reference to some seminal examples from contemporary Indian music, the lyrics of protest songs may be directed at general social attitudes or behavior. Azadi by Divine, contemporary, which was based in contemporary social condition, systematic patterns of behavior, Blue Nation by the War Beat. It talks about the structural violence against Dalits or specific incidents and events. For example, Hum Kagaz Nahi Dikhange by Varun Grover, which was used in NRCCA protest. Songs can travel faster than any other forms of literary creation because of the music and rhythm they play an intrinsic role in the evolution of cultures. Songs are seemingly fluid and portable. They can cross borders, be translated into many languages, change meanings, and span eras. Nourished by the spirit of solidarity among peoples suffering under authoritarian, a resistance song is open to appropriation, adaptation, and reinvention. Within 60s, due to the trends of globalization and technological advancement, socio-politically aware songs began to be composed, adapted internationally in other semiotic systems. This includes translation of anti-war songs, civil rights songs, protest songs, so topical songs, agitational songs, freedom songs, message songs, movement songs, socially conscious songs, solidarity songs, spirituals or resistance, sorrow songs, songs of liberation, songs of dissent, the people's songs, labor anthems, political folk music, and others. In a country like India, translation plays an important role in uniting its citizens, irrespective of their languages, cultures, religions, and regions. For centuries, translation has remained as a key device for transporting ideas. Whenever a protest, a movement, or a war occurred in history across the Indian subcontinent, voices from one place to another travel on the wheels of translation. In the pre-independence era, India has witnessed the flow of nationalistic ideas for the sake of public awareness through the mass translation of political songs, slogans, novels, etc. In the past years, India has observed in-country translation of foreign songs as well as regional songs, often in subtle localized versions for almost every protest, whether it was about the Nirbhaya case in 2012 or the farmers' protest in 2021. Notably mentioned during the NRC-CA protest, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Urdu song Hum Dekhenge, Varun Grover's Hum Kagaz Nahi Dikhayenge, or the Italian protest folk song Bella Ciao were widely translated in different regional languages as it happened before, with the communist songs like The International and We Shall Overcome. The post-independence years have witnessed the increasing role of music in the communist movement with the development of specific Marxist songs dealing with the social conditions of workers, partly inspired from the American folk movement. The translation of the socio-political songs, the international uh, and We Shall Overcome belong to the communist era. These songs were almost translated into every Indian languages, including Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Malayalam, etc. Mohit Banerjee translated the International into Bengali, and it was widely used during the Naxalite movement as Jago Jago Sarbohara. We Shall Overcome, on the other hand, was sung in Bengali by Bhupen Hazarika as Amra Korbo Joy. Bangla Jibanmukhi movement, centered around the Bengali folk rock culture, initiated by Suman Chatterjee, followed by Nochiketa and Anjan Dotto, dealt with the daily life and strife of Kolkata in 90s. Social issues, poverty, frustration, and anger experienced by youth. This movement directly brought European American songs of resistance in Bengali culture by translating, transcribing, or often recreating the original ones. Sumon's approach, which he says has taken years to develop and refine, is situated in the resumption of topics from the American folk song he adapted in Bengali, sometimes changing the rhythm or the lyrics, sometimes adding a stanza. Thus, Sumon made a cover of anti-war song Where Have All the Flowers Gone by Pete Seeger. He added a final verse and the song became in Bengali the equivalent of Where Have They Gone. His version is titled as Kothay Galo Tara. Sumon has also adapted Blowing in the Wind by Bob Dylan, transforming the initial rhythms in 4/4, very common in the rock music, into a less common 5/4, although it is to be found in jazz with the famous Take 5 by Dave Brubeck, and goes together well with the pace of Bengali folk songs. Indian protest songs in translation are not limited in the The nationwide protest against NRC-CA in the end of 2019, which was continued for a few more months of 2020 till COVID-19 pandemic ravaged the country, introduced mass translation of protest songs. Though the numerous forms of songs translation practices, beginning with the fusion of two language cultures, was highly visible, translation of lyrics into the target language, which is an Indian language in our research, while the music and sometimes few prominent terms remain intact and unchanged. While the song is being mixed with the Indian regional folk traditions through the prism of the daily and communal concerns. Very often, translation practices remain vague. It is the protest that translates a protest song, and the translator remains invisible throughout. Here I am providing two examples from the protest. Faiz Ahmed Faiz Urdu song Hum Dekhenge is now available in Bhojpuri and Kannada language. Similarly, Bella Ciao, the anti-fascist Italian song, was also created in several languages. While the phrase Bella Ciao and the music remained same in the songs, the rest of the songs was changed. Indian protest songs in translation are not limited in the protest fascist regimes or political movements, but also there are numerous songs which have been translated and used in protests by marginals, women, Dalit, and Adivasi people. For instance, Indian women have made a Bengali version of the famous Chilean protest anthem, A Rapist in Your Path, to oppose the PM in 2020 when he visited Kolkata. The Bengali translation title, Dharshok Tumi, was crafted by a group of women who met on social media. They then began practicing the song at Kolkata's Jadavpur University and first took it on to the streets on January 4, when they performed it outside the city's iconic New Market. We wanted to highlight the patriarchal violence that Modi's idea of Hindu Rashtra represents. Apola Banerjee, one of the women from the group performing the anthem, shared, I am done with my presentation. Here I am showing the song that I collected. And here's the Bhojpuri and Kannada version of Faiz Ahmed Faiz's song.
हम हूँ देखब हम देखबे करब उ बिहान की जेकर क्रिया ह जे ब्रह्म बाबा के लिखल ह हम हूँ देखब जब जुलुम जोड़ के सब पहाड़ रुई जैसन छितरा जाई सब दुखिया जन के लात तरे इ धरती डगमग करे लागी आउ जबर के मुड़ियन पर सीधे बज्जर बिजुरी गिरे लागी हम हूँ देखब सब माटी के मूरत जे ही दिन घुरा पर फेंकल जाई हो हम दू कौड़ी के लोगन के मसनद पर बिठावल जाई हो जब दैव के नाम पर सजल सिंहासन छितर बितर हो जाई हो सब मौरी पगड़ी भुइया गिरी सब सिंहासन हिल जाई हो बस नाम रही उहे दई के जे नहीं खन तब वो इहवे हवन जे देखे और दिखावेलन हम ही हई दब के डंका बजी जे तू हूँ हवा आओ हम हूँ हैं और दैव के परजा राज करी जे तू हूँ हवा और हम हूँ हैं हम
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was very interesting actually. So this paper was actually in collaboration with Ms. Madhuri Krishna and Mr. Amandeep Das,
Yes,
is independent researcher at Banaras Hindu University. And I think Ms. Madhuri Krishna is from Tata Institute of Social Sciences.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So I think the last video which you showed us, you said Kannada, but it was Bhojpuri.
It was Bhojpuri. There was Kannada language, Kannada version later on.
Okay.
I only played the Bhojpuri version.
Good. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
And we will have our third presentation by Dr. Tonisha Goi, who is assistant professor at Geetham School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Her paper's title is History, Gaze and Identity Project in Bengali Middle Class Modernity. Translation as an act of epistemic intervention. So over to you, Dr. Tonisha Goi.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible? Can I start?
Yes, yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon, and a big thanks to the organizers and paper presenters for such a smooth and thoughtful event. In writing, speaking, being, language, and the historical formation of identities in India, Sudipta Kaviraj says that language not only unites people, it also as effectively divides them. The social hierarchy is entrenched within what he calls the internal economy of a language. In practice, often subtly, covertly transcend visible categories like dialects, where privileged dialects are favored over disprivileged ones, depending on subject positions like class, caste, occupations, and genders of its speakers, into more nuanced displays. The complexity of the story of language and identities cannot be tackled without a sufficiently complex conception of the gradations of competence in language and its political effect. That's what he says. I shall call this the internal economy of language. It is safe to say that while translating a text from one language to another, communicating the internal economy of the source language and source text effectively is the fundamental goal of any successful translation. In it, some aspects of both the competence and performance of a language are deemed extremely difficult to find synonymous expressions for that in that of another language. Common examples of these would be innuendos, colloquiums, dialectic variations, and certain idioms. In the discussed text that I'm going to talk about soon, for instance, some words have been deliberately left unchanged and a glossary has been provided, since their close English synonyms were either not available or felt to be entirely out of place and jarring. Sometimes dialectic variations are tackled by substituting one dialect with a roughly equally positioned one of the target language. Thus, a low-caste, poor villager's so-called unpolished dialect may be translated into Creole or Pidgin English, or that of an urban slum dwellers to that of Cockney, given the target language is English, to communicate the linguistic contrast. Of course, such attempts can only be limited successes, depending on the kind of text at hand. The internal economy of language, however, runs into deeper structures. Vibhutibhushan Mukhopadhyay's Shiksha Sankot, an educational crisis, my translation, was written in the 1960s by an educated, middle-class, bilingual, urban service sector male author, not unlike the Bengalis Kaviraj mentions benefiting from the Kayastha Leap. The story is presented as a light comedy situated during the Indian nationalist movement's latter, Gandhian phase, and describes a social battle of sexes spearheaded by a newly married Gandhian volunteer and a middle-aged, mid-ranking railway official. Much of the story revolves around very polarized, gendered socializing spaces sketched by the author, and ends in a farcical switch of gender roles, leading to mutual embarrassment. Despite its light thread, the story takes up the idea of modernity, or Bengali Adhunikata, and women's roles during the nationalist movement with some seriousness. Yet, most of the debates it tries playing out to question old-fashioned men and their deeply misogynistic, patriarchal injuncts as opposed to modern, idealist, politically active and opinionated young women, get reduced to storms and teacups. The fact that the story is told by a covertly unreliable narrator, pretending omniscience, could be a crucial reason for it. Another factor could be the overriding male gaze pervading the story. The most crucial question that concerns us in this, however, is how the above two get played out, not just in more obvious descriptions and emphasis. None of the men are introduced or described, for instance, while most of the women are presented as caricatures, while both parties, one may argue, have equally sensible and or ludicrous conversations. But in subtle, perhaps unconscious shifts of languages, gestures employed, dialects, idioms, and sometimes English words switched to and from. This subterranean shift in tone are very difficult to translate adequately. Yet it is the minutiae that manage major tectonic shifts in character representations. It is interesting how the author sometimes uses English in the original text to denote a slight derision. Hence, when an elderly dowager who smokes the hubble is christened by the men as Tobacco Queen, it is unanimously assumed that the reader will also share the joke. Also, matron smoking is an aberration only for the modern Bhadralok sensibility, and hence can function as an essentially modern joke. Some of the real deadlocks that the story introduces in terms of gendered roles and role reversals, things one would consider extremely pivotal given the story's plot, get entirely sidetracked because of the persistent trivializing humor that follows. One has a feeling that the author, as the truly modern Bhadralok flag bearer he identifies himself as within the text, hopes to create an allegory of sorts that prescribes correct codes of conduct the modern man is supposed to inculcate. Yet, simultaneously, there is a disbelieving trivializing of the female protagonist's so-called ideological ardor. The author is not entirely comfortable about the kind of agency and questions his protagonist raises, but cannot decide whether she ought to be rewarded or punished for it. The story is marked by the subtextual acute discomfort, teamed with a very prescriptive male gaze. And it is these undertones that are baffling in the process of translation. The form of the story is just about enough paradoxical to its contents for the translation to sometimes go out of the way and alter the contents so that the overall tone may be communicated consistently enough. This follows one's conclusion that a translation, despite its prerequisite of not altering the content, the semantic meaning, and as much as possible form of the original source text, is fundamentally meta or transformative work. Transformativework.org defines a transformative work as one that takes something extant and turns it into something with a new purpose, sensibility, or mode of expression. Transformative works include, but are not limited to, fan fiction, fan videos, and fan art. A transformative use is one that, in the words of the US Supreme Court, adds something new with a further purpose or different character, altering the source with new expression, meaning, or message. By this definition, translating the mentioned short story amounts to being a transformative work, since the same work can be very accurately, yet wrongly, translated to look like a feminist piece. A translator cannot assume a neutral, uninvolved surface translation of the work. It doesn't hold together as a coherent piece if they do. No synonymous word functions as a pure or perfect synonym. Alien cultural undertones manifested through the chosen words of the source and target language conflate unproductively. Hence, the translation of the spoken but assumed differences in words uttered in public as opposed to those spoken in private. The righteous brag of the men as opposed to the informal gossip of the women in deeply gendered language aren't unsuccessful, but leave a lot more to be desired. One feels as if there are secret languages within scenes that are at work significantly enough but cannot be decoded. Of course, the fundamental defense of translation being transformative lies in Stuart Hall's definition of representation as a mode of creation of meaning. Negating any presupposed original meaning of an object or event, there is a radical shift in perspective. Hall argues that nothing can have one fixed meaning owing to individual perspectives, interpretations, and differentiated contexts. Thus, meaning of an object or event is created through its articulation via communicative devices like language. Articulation itself thus becomes a representation, and there is no meaning in a pre-represented stage. Representation becomes an intrinsic part of the subject represented, and reality does not exist outside the process of representation. In the translation at hand, for instance, the term government, standing for government, has been reproduced. In being a slur in words that can be looked at as a commonplace flaw, but a flaw nonetheless, it was the only visible negative trait attributed to the men's speeches, as opposed to the numerous in that of the women's. In the text, there are characters like Sunri and Tetri's mother, who clearly make up a not insignificant part of the women's circle, but who are not accorded more than a brief mention, since the Bhadralok cannot concern himself beyond a point with these women, who are implicitly lower caste and explicitly Bihari or Hindustani or non-Bengali. However, this distinction disappears in the translation, since the linguistic and cultural hegemony of English over the Indian languages functions in a less subtle and overlapping way than the cultural dominance of the multilingual Bhadralok with his awe of English and his derogatory view of Hindi and speakers of it. The story at hand and the problems faced in translating an excerpt from it embody and echo Kaviraj's concerns regarding the tensions between modernity and democracy in a nascent Indian state, owing to what can be partially defined as the cultural bilingualism practiced by one hegemonic, esoteric social group. The same ambiguity and authorial discomfort that marks the text as a difficult translation, or more accurately, as one for which no one single correct translation may be available, opens it up as a unity, that is, in terms of both form and content, to what J. Devika, in Being in Translation in a Post-Colony, translating feminism in Kerala state, India, calls multiple modes of translation. Despite, or perhaps because of its structural uneasiness, multiple potential meanings are rendered possible once this unease or discomfort is acknowledged. One may denounce this text as an anti-feminist, misogynist one, or one may look for the opportunities it offers in looking at erstwhile pockets of silence, especially of the domain of what we broadly call the private. The different intersectionalities at work in the multiple subject positions, which determine the way the gender roles are played out within a familiar, even prototypical Bhadralok setting. In that, the latter grants both the text and its author their own agencies numerously, while interrogating its hegemonic politics of representation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So far, all the presentations have been within time limit. And I don't know whether Dr. P. Samta is present now, because she was supposed to be presenting at the end. All the three papers are over. And
No, sir, she's not available today.
Okay, so maybe she can present in some other session. Or
Yes,
ma'am.
Yeah, she's not able to present today, it seems.
So
maybe she'll present some.
She can be accommodated in some other session then. Yeah. So now the floor is open for question answers or exchange with the participants. We still have enough time, so we can have a very good discussion around the papers. Okay, then in that case, I will ask the first question, if you allow. And this is to the first presenter, Dr. Sanju Thomas. Yeah, who was talking about Indian literature written in English and translations from Indian languages into English. So I saw one quotation that was, in fact, the first quotation by Meenakshi Mukherjee, where you're talking about the difference in the reception of Indian novels, Indian English novels, and the novels translated from Indian languages into English. So I'm a bit curious, what kind of difference in reception exists?
Okay, this this is in her book, The Perishable Empire, where she talks about how the reception of translations, that's not received well. The English translations of Bhasha literatures are not received well. While even when, that's also written in English, and the Indian English fiction seems to have an edge over English translations of Bhasha texts. So that was what she was talking about. So this is what she says, that it is divided by the same language. Though both the languages are available in English, somehow it looks as if the translations have, I mean, maybe because of this idea that this is a derivative art and this is inferior, somehow the reception is not as good as the Indian English text.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Any other question to any of the speakers?
Taking up the issue of this asymmetry that existed, supposed to have existed in the 90s and now disappeared between Indian language literatures and Indian English literature. Do we need to, what this asymmetry represents? Yes, being in a central university and looking at it is one thing. But I can say that if you look at the translation scenario into Indian languages, compared to the translation from other languages into Indian languages, the translation of Indian writing in English into Indian languages is very skimpy. You hardly find fewer writers in Indian English being translated into Indian languages. You can count them in numbers, in fingers. So the English academia in India or in the elsewhere in the world, if you assume that the English translation of Indian writing is meant for the global audience or the Indian audience, this academia, which is the main consumption of this literature, though it talks favorably, it also mourns that there is some kind of hierarchy, assuming that they are on top and then this Indian writing in English, Indian writing in other languages is somewhere else. But actually, if you look at it from the perspective of the those languages, Indian languages, they don't give a vote for this Indian writing in English. Even when Salman Rushdie wrote critically in 1990s about Bhasha literature, I don't think it mattered much to the critics or writers in Indian languages. I can say this from the point of view of Kannada literature. Nobody cared about it. Who is he? Is the question that they asked. But only we in the academia, people like Meenakshi Mukherjee, people like Sujit and others are worried about it. Because our art lies somewhere else and we are here. So is it this perceived hierarchy and the theorization that goes around it, is it the problem that is out there, or is it the problem of the English teachers by profession, but by love they're towards Indian literature? So this is the question that I wanted to ask. And then about this, what is happening in the publishing industry? At the end of 90s, again, when this issue was taken up in many seminars and conferences, when Sujit was still alive, and Meenakshi was also very much alive, was that both the boom in Indian writing in English that happened in the 80s and 90s, and the boom consequently in Indian writing in English translation, were both the creation of the publishers. Once they created a boom in Indian writing in English, they couldn't sustain it. There was a demand and there were not many writers. So they had to go to Indian writing in translation to cater to that boom, which was created by them. So in that sense, one is the politics of the publishing industry, that apart. The other is who is perceiving this hierarchy and why they are perceiving it. Can we reverse the gaze and look at it from the perspective of Bhasha literatures? How do they look at these Indian writers in English? Is the question that I would like to pose to Sanju. Thank you for that paper.
Yeah. So see, about the first question, see, I mean, I think that, yeah, I know that, a lot of maybe Bhasha writers didn't care at all. And there was this question as to who this is. But then there was also a kind of debate around that time about Salman Rushdie calling the Bhasha writings or, parochial and tractor literature and all that. So there was a kind of a debate. And I think that especially when it comes to international recognition, I don't know. I felt that there was some debates. There were some discussions about the authenticity part of Indian English fiction and Bhasha writings. Also, I remember writers like M. Mukundan, who had said that because of translation, from a regional writer, I have now become a national writer. In fact, he said it when he won the crossword prize for On the Banks of the Mayari Puriyada Teerangalil, and also when he won it in an interview in Delhi. Delhi, the girl has been translated as Delhi a Soliloquy. So, I mean, it's not as if they also, everybody would like to have, more readers, right? So I think that, there are writers who are happy that they are translated and they have a large reader base. Maybe they might not have thought so much about Indian English writing itself, but I think that they also would have wanted, or they still want, for example, in India, in Kerala, for instance, immediately when a work is, when a Malayalam fiction especially, because I am aware of the Malayalam fiction part, whenever there is a text that comes out, immediately, almost immediately, there are translations available. So it is not as if, they are not interested.
Shall I chip in
Some
again?
of, sorry.
Sanjay, shall I
Yeah,
chip in again, if you permit?
Yeah,
please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there are two issues here. One is the politics of English translation in India. That there I completely agree with you, I concede. Every Indian writer is worried about their translations into English, and unless they get translated into English, they won't become an Indian writer. There is no, I have no quarrel at all. But comparing themselves with Indian writing in English is something that I have not seen. Many of them even don't know who are the people who are writing in English too. But getting translated into English, visibility at the national level, yes. So the politics of English, which makes you an English writer, Indian writer, that is very much there. But this putting both on two scales and then comparing the two, that I have not seen from their perspective.
No, I don't think I have. I was doing that. I was actually looking at translations and Indian English fiction. It was not
I
about.
did not accuse you of doing that. I accused you of
but
others.
I take that point. Yes, yes.
And yes, like there are certain writers who were also privileged. For example, M. Mukundan, as you said, that he was working in the French embassy and he had translated some of his works into French, some of the stories, and he was very well connected in that sense also to the outer world. So anyway, any other question?
I think Dr. Sanjay pointed out this aspect of Mukundan working somewhere. Similarly, Girish Karnad. So within this literary circles in Indian languages, this hierarchy exists. Those who have connections in certain places and how they become popular in English, apart from translation. This is apart from translation. Yes, through translation, they becoming Indian writer and gaining some kind of visibility at the national level is one. And through other connections, through films like Girish Karnad, they're becoming visible. That hierarchy and that tension always exists between others who are unable to gain that visibility and people like these writers who gain this visibility. That is also quite interesting to look at. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sir, may I ask a question to Atmaram?
Yeah, sure, please.
It was really good to see that paper on ethnomusicality. We have been talking about how there is a politics of representation that goes on about folk or baul music, about mainstream singers appropriating and then copywriting particular folk songs in particular ways. And we have seen that across domains. So Dabang's Munni Badnaam Hui is a folk song that Dabang's like folk singers have complained about how they are not allowed to sing very easily right after the movie was released because T-Series suddenly decided to copyright it. So how would you respond to this changing domain of copyright and intellectual property when it comes to the kind of material that you're looking at, where, you know, the boundaries are so thin, there's a constant cultural osmosis that's going on?
Hello, and thank you for asking this question. Yes, there are such trends and such practices which are ongoing, and it is not new at all. Like there are other songs, like recently happened, Ganda Fool, you remember, I guess. So there are artists who sing or who create the songs, and they are not recognized when the song is popular, or whatever. The thing is, what I feel that there is a necessity for recreating or for transcreating art or art forms, especially music. To in case of what we do in translation, we just transfer the idea, transfer the meaning from one language to another language. So this is very important for music to reach another culture, in which same I mean, this thing happens with many songs. Like I talked about Bela Ciao, and then I talked about Hum Dekhenge. So unless that practice is done, the circulation of the idea, the circulation of the meaning is impossible. Now the thing is copyright. Particularly my paper talked about the protest songs. When protest songs are being translated, it in most of the cases it doesn't have a particular translator, because no one knows who actually translated it, because history doesn't recognize that. But history recognize that it is being translated. Okay, that is the thing with protest songs. We don't know like who translated Hum Dekhen, or this Bela Ciao, the Bengali version, or that song women sang when PM visited. And in other cases, like when it is not a protest song, or particularly someone has a copyright over a song, and it is like most of the tribal, most of the indigenous songs do not have a copyright thing. And like the newcomers, like the ones who are using those songs in or recreating those songs, they are have that copyright, they have that idea of copywriting and all. So they are basically you can say, yeah, it is kind of an exploitation. It is of course an exploitation when we do not give the rights. But I guess and I believe that the rights should be given, and it should be recognized, especially whenever these things are happening. So this is my take. Like whenever there is a proper author and there is a proper translator and we know them, so the right should be given, and it should be recognized by the audience or whoever listening to the song or enjoying it. That is my take on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, the question of copyright is very tricky, because it's supposed to be a very modern capitalist concept where it's like it's your private property, that whatever you have written. So you are not recognizing the contribution of the community in which you are living. In earlier oral tradition, then there were singers who used to sing, and then they could also make certain changes, without consulting, because nobody knew who wrote originally and then composed originally, and then later on you add something on your own, you delete certain lines, sometimes deliberately, sometimes because you forget those lines and you want to present something new, in that place, it was a part of oral tradition, very much accepted. But well, with the modernity, then you are looking for the copyright, and there have been several cases of people accusing of copying. But well, mostly like from the folk songs, when you put it in Bollywood or somewhere, this sometimes this kind of hierarchy is there that, and people, unfortunately, the urban audience, they come to know about these songs from Bollywood rather than from the folk songs. So there are so many folk songs, I think, which existed. So for example, Rang Barse also existed, yes. But then we recognize it as something written by Harivansh Rai Bachchan. So yes, well, that's something interesting. But I also had one question to Mr. Atmadeep.
Yes,
it was, yeah, it was about, like, you gave the example of Bella Ciao also, and yes. In general, or if you want to reply it in some specific way, that you said that these protest songs sometimes were translated differently. I mean, they kept the music and the rhythm and everything, but then the words were changed. So can you give some examples, if you can think of where the words were changed, or in what sense, like what was the impact?
Okay. Yeah. Sir, can you please clarify the question a bit? I mean, can you explain a bit?
I'm saying that you said that some of these protest songs in translation, they kept the music, they kept the rhythm, but they changed the words.
Changed the, yes, sir. Yes, like if we consider the case of Bella Ciao, like Bella Ciao, the main phrase, it is intact, it is same when we transcribed that version. But now what happened when translation happened or transcription happened, a complete different, they, whoever translated it or which protest it is used, it matters really which in which protest we are using the song. So that song gets a form particularly, or gets a shape for that protest. In Bella Ciao, in the version of that Bella Ciao, there are lines which are targeting the government, which are talking about the situation, and that is in a very localized way. If we are looking at the version that was played in Kolkata, then Shashok Jao, and something like that. So and there are such other lines. So the main Asians, one thing that is important here, like we all know the song as Bella Ciao, like whoever and wherever he's staying. Okay, so when he will listen that Bella Ciao is the main thing, like the recreation of Bella Ciao happened, so it will get attention. And secondly, it is a song of protest. And now the other thing is expressing something of ours. Like when we transcreate something, like especially in protest, what we are doing, we are telling our issue, which is localized in our position, in our place. So we are deliberately speaking that thing. We are deliberately trying to make the citizens understand our situation, our condition, our problems. So when lyrics are being changed, they are their focus. I mean, this is in the focus that our problems remain in that lyrics. And the music remains same, because it creates the appeal. Because in cases this might not be I mean always same, but in Bella Ciao this was like they kept the music, because that music has that appeal, that music has that recognition, so everyone can sing, everyone can unite their voices togetherly. So that was the idea, I guess, behind this. Yeah, and it happens very naturally. Like, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Atmadeep. Here we have two people raising hands. So first of all, I think Professor Tarakeswar, he wants to comment or
Give chance to
ask a
Usha
question?
Mudiganti. I will come back later.
Yeah, okay. Then we have Usha Mudiganti. Yeah, please go ahead with
Hi,
the
thank
question.
you. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity of asking this question. Am I audible?
Yes, it's perfect. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the question I wanted to ask is connected to Atmadeep's paper, and it's more or less a rookie question, I feel, because when Atmadeep was speaking, and when you, Dr. Sanjay, were commenting on the tradition of the Indian tradition of many songs getting used again and again in various ways, without copyrights and things like that. I was reminded of a talk that I had heard Shubha Mudgal give, and Shubha Mudgal, and this was in some Speak Mackey concert or something of that sort. And Shubha Mudgal said that earlier, when we used to sing, we would just touch our earlobe and say, and that would indicate that we are giving a tribute to the guru that we had learned from. That was our way of mm, acknowledging that this song existed before we sing it with our interpretation, right? So in a largely oral culture, there are these moments of interpretation that take place when a song is taking a new form, right? So I was wondering where the boundaries between adaptation and translation blur, uh, when an old folk song or an existing cultural song is repeated by a singer in a new form. So I don't know if Atmadeep can answer this question right away. I'm not saying that he should. I'm just saying that, I would like to hear more reflection on this.
Okay.
You can take my questions two together, Atmadeep.
Okay.
They are related.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sanjay, for that comment on copyright, and then Usha coming in and talking about Indian tradition. See, when we are talking about protest literature, the idea of protest literature itself is it gives a voice to a particular community, a group. In that sense, it is not an individual voice. So it is not a romantic idea that literature is an expression of a powerful emotions recollected in tranquility of an individual. So here you are giving a voice to the entire collective. So again, this copyright idea comes from this romantic notion of literature. So there is a tension in that sense between these two ideas of literature. That one point. And the second point is, if we are continuing with this idea of individual identifying text with individuals, one of our students worked on translation of translations by Suman of American protest poetry into Bengali.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what we found out was that, see, there is a context to this protest poetry in America, Vietnam War and other things. And what was happening in Bengal then? So it was the left government which was ruling, and people like Suman were unhappy with the left. And we know, if you look at the career of Suman himself, where
he was also unhappy.
So in that sense, when we associate this protest poetry with individuals, and when the individuals move on in terms of their political ideology, then how do we associate this poetry with that individual? So this tension between two ideas of poetry or literature, and then the tension is something that is visible in our discussion. So I just wanted to put it forth. I think the same thing applies to another issue raised by Usha. When is translation and adaptation? When it ceases to be a translation and when it ceases to be adaptation? See, the line between the two is very spurious. because there are two concepts, we think they are two different things. I would say all translations are adaptations, all adaptations are translations. So this is a tricky question, and it all depends on how do we look, how do we define translation. If you define translation, means defining the relationship between the two texts. What is the relationship in which these two texts exist? When do we say that, sorry, when do we say that two texts are in translation relation? When it is similar to that and also different from it. If it is similar to it, it is a source text. When it is similar to that but also different from it, then it is translation. But how much of difference will qualify it to be adaptation? How much of difference will qualify it to be an independent text, not even adaptation, is something that is left to us, because there is no exact scale on which we can measure what is translation, what is adaptation, what is independent text. If there is a relationship between the two texts, then we call it as translational relations now, rather than strictly making a boundary between translation and adaptation. So in that sense, that is fine. But this tension between the individual and the collective that exists in our theoretical approach to translation of music. But translation of music is an interesting area of research within translation studies. Thank you for focusing on that.
Thank you, sir. Currently, I don't have the answers. You are just in the questions you raised and the answer for them, because I am my thesis did not focus on that thing like adaptation and translation. Like I need to do that. Yes, so I will further research on that thing. And thank you for this insight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also believe there is nothing like between translation and adaptation, anything which is like discrete, it is rather continuum. So at what point of time a translation should be called adaptation, it is very difficult, because when we are translating, we have, of course, a certain sense of the original text or the text which we are translating. And then also we are thinking about the audience for whom we are translating.
Yes.
Yeah. So after that, we have this in commitment to the readers also, whether we are conveying to the reader the text which I am translating. So there, lies the kind of negotiation that to what extent I should make certain modifications. And sometimes these modifications are not at the conscious level also, they happen at the unconscious level also. And then to what extent we can take liberty with the text, with the source text we are translating. Yes. So again, it's a very it's a ticklish problem. Yeah, anyway, so, but thanks for raising these questions. These questions are very much valid. I think, do we have some other questions? We are almost nearing to the end of the session. If quickly we can have any last question, or we will just. Okay. Yeah, so in that case, I think, thank you very much for joining, and thank you for these excellent papers, for raising certain questions, commenting, and participating vigorously to this discussion and making it successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanjay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sanju Thomas, Atmadeep, and Tanisha Goin for such illuminating papers. I'm sure we all have taken something back from your paper and have added to the already existing corpus knowledge about translation which we have. Thank you so much for such wonderful presentation. And my heartiest thank you and gratitude to Dr. Sanjay for chairing the session and for his igniting comments and questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanjay. And now we are heading towards the third session, which is titled as Children's Literature and Translation. Over to the next comparer. Thank you so much.
Should we begin?
Yes, Abhijit.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Abhijit Kumar Darve, a PhD scholar at the Department of Translation Studies in the EFL University, Hyderabad. First and foremost, I welcome all our guests and participants for joining us for the third session of the 4-day online international seminar titled Translation as Reconstitution, Issues of Self, Canon, History and Memory in India, which is organized by the Department of Translation Studies, the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. Let me introduce Dr. S. Chinnadevi, who will be the chair for the third session titled Children's Literature and Translation Studies of the seminar. So Dr. Chinnadevi Singadi is an assistant professor in the Department of Indian and World Literatures at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. She teaches and guides research in world literature and women studies. She is also a poet and a songwriter. Her wide range of publications include poems, research articles, travel essays, book reviews, as well as collection of ghazals. Title Ishq Ka Asar, Song of Love. So now I invite ma'am to kindly chair the session, and I also request ma'am to kindly ask the presenters to complete their paper presentation within stipulated time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abhijit, for the kind words. How much time does each candidate get to make the presentation?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So let me first welcome Sandil Bhardwaj, Assistant Professor, Italian Studies, Department of Hispanic and Italian Studies, EFL University, to make the presentation on Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Books in the context of children's literature.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, Sandhya.
Thank you, ma'am. I thank all the organizers of this event for this thoughtful event, and I congratulate all the paper presenters because since morning I am seeing everyone and they are giving such an insightful thoughts on their papers, and I would like to gather the opportunity to present my paper. May I?
Yeah, please.
Oh, thank you so much. The title of my paper is Kipling's Jungle Books in the Context of Children's Literature. Cinema and literature have had a long, unending relationship with each other ever since the commerce of filmmaking started. Literature has always been one of the major inspiration for motion pictures, since both books and films represent the art of storytelling. A novel and a movie picture are different kinds of works, but with the same purpose, that is to convey something. This notion can be emphasized by the ways they are enjoyed. While a novel is enjoyed through reading, a film or TV show is enjoyed through watching. Hutchon states, quote, as a product, an adaptation can be given a formal definition, but other aspects have to be considered as a process of creation and reception. There also appears the wall of translation, but adaptation in a way is translation too, unquote. In this new understanding of translation, adaptations are remediations to a different medium in the form of intersemiotic transpositions from one sign system, for example, words, to another, for example, images. Bluestone affirms, quote, the major difference between a filmic representation and a novel is that visual images stimulate our perceptions directly through language, color, movement, and sound, whereas stimulation is indirect in the case of written text, unquote. The other thing that differentiates a novel and a film is that a novel is controlled by one person, the author, whereas the meaning a film conveys to the audience results from a collaborative effort of many. Thus, taking into account the notion of adaptation as a translation into the medium, the present study discusses a particular adaptation of the classical Western narrative structure through the comparative analysis of the novel Jungle Book and the Japanese anime series known as Jungle Book Shonen Mowgli in particular, that was dubbed in Hindi for Indian audience. This Japanese anime series was an adaptation of Rudyard Kipling's 1894 original collection of stories and has India, then a colony of England, as the background. This Jungle Book anime was aired on Indian television in 1989. The present paper views the said anime as an intersemiotic translation that resulted in the reconstitution of a foreign text, epitomizing a subtle blending of sameness and difference. Supporting the idea of Lawrence Venuti, a translation theorist, the remediation of the anime in Hindi in the same virtual medium can be considered an interlingual translation because it is the reconstitution of a foreign text with the cross-cultural transposition in another linguistic group. The paper considers how genre and structure get affected during the process of reconstitution beyond the criterion of fidelity. Like any other adapted text, even this anime represents a degree of compromise where Kipling's notion about the jungle are retained, but many elements are combined as well altered to suit the sensibilities of modern children. The investigation presents examples of the adaptive shifts that took place in the original. Anachronistic elements such as racial stereotypes that emerged from the prevailing post-Pullian theme have taken another shape in the anime with an eye on the social and market relevance. According to Desmond, the common reason that literary classic exists as a great source for filmic representations is that author has already completed the creative process of inventing plots, characters, and worlds. As Rudyard was born and grew up in India, he knew a lot about India and was fascinated with the jungle, as his parents were part of the wave of British nationals who moved to the country. Kipling paints the picture of a jungle that has rules, outsiders, and leaders, just like the human world. A little known fact is that the surroundings of the Pench Tiger Reserve in the central state of Madhya Pradesh inspired this iconic book. Kipling projected many of his experience through a feral boy, Mowgli, who was raised away from people of his kind and who ends up being a part of an altogether different community and set of people. The character of Mowgli was based on a true story narrated by British administrator Sir William Henry Sleeman about a boy, Dina Sanicher, raised by wolves. The stories in the Jungle Book were inspired, albeit in part, by the ancient Indian fable texts such as the Panchtantra. Like any other fantasy, this text too presents in animals anthropomorphically, like walking, talking, reasoning, and living as almost exact analogues for the facets of human personality. Mueller states, quote, adaptations of canonical texts have performed a key role throughout the history of children's literature, as it requires numerous pertinent adjustments during the creation of new audiovisual text, unquote. For example, ranging from changes of small deletion to deletion or alteration of entire part of a story to meet the intellect of the new audience with the idea that the new version meant for children should have a pedagogic role. As a result, there is no anti-native representation of the post-Pullian structure on this platform of moving images, as it could negatively impact young children who have more malleable minds than adults. It is argued that in the process of transposing a novel into a filmic product, several constraints influence the adapter's decisions, like the target audience requirement in terms of age, degrees of comprehension of the text for the hearing impaired, inappropriate projection of divergent social values, or commercial concern, to mention a few. Julie Sanders states that during the process of translation, many literary pieces meant for children have to be subjected to adaptation as per requirements. The translation made of Pinocchio, Gulliver Travels, King Solomon Mines, Robinson Crusoe, etc. in different periods are among the examples. In India, Jungle Book Shonen Mowgli gained more popularity than any other version of the Jungle Book. The Hindi version of the opening song, Jangal Jangal Baat Chali Hai, was an instant hit. The anime was closely dubbed to Hindi with a local and intimate touch. To date, whenever Jungle Book is referred, Indians relate more to the anime than to any other version. One such example is that when the live-action Disney film Jungle Book was released in 2016, for the title track of the Hindi dub version, a remake of Jungle Jungle Baat Chaliye was used rather than remaking of the Disney title track. The word anime, pronounced as anime, is an abbreviation of the word animation in Japanese. As per the Merriam-Webster dictionary, anime is referred specifically to Japanese disseminated animation style, often characterized by colorful graphics, vibrant characteristics, and fantastical themes, unquote. In a world where almost every acclaimed film and novel claims to bring out the reality in all its nakedness, the world of anime is quite anti-realistic. The Japanese anime has overshadowed the original Kipling's work, where his sinister jungle is presented to the audience with a myriad of vibrant worlds. This enchants the viewers with its enigmatic fantasies and romanticism. The use of vibrant colors and sharp animations for the projection of tropical forest spread over the land is an allegory of the togetherness of the philosophy of nature and mankind in our moving text, and it generates the impression of romanticism. In the 21st century, this utopian model of Eden has retained its romantic attraction for us who have moved far away from that model and style of life. Hachon states, quote, most theories of adaptation assume, however, that the story is the common denominator. In adapting, equivalences are sought in different science systems for the various elements of the story, its themes, events, worlds, characters, motivations, point of views, consequences, context, symbols, imaginary, and so on, unquote. Kipling's novel and the anime both reflect the function of classical Western narrative structure, and yet there are dynamics of exchanges that exist both the versions. The story has remained popular and has inspired umpteen adaptations, though its underlying message has been questioned by several critics who see this text as a relic of Britain's colonial past with several dark undertones. It is a challenge to Kipling's controversial presentation of colonialism and its racial implications. A deliberate attempt was made to negotiate between Rudyard Kipling's checkered inheritance and domestication of the tale, creating a sweet and hilarious animation where peace and goodness defeat violence and cruelty. Through this series, the textual trump of the British Raj has been questioned by overturning the authoritative voice of the white man's burden. Mowgli, a humankind, so to say, was a typical outcome of imperialist fabrication. While the strong and cunning Sher Khan represent the native, the gentle Mowgli is the epitome of British imperialism. But the anime replays this significant dichotomy of characters sans its colonial undertones. It throws away the notions of colonial subjugation by replacing the image of a poster boy of imperial hegemony with the image of a fun-loving juvenile dynamism, and by highlighting important bonds like harmony, teamwork, friendship with the creatures of other species also. Many fictional works having the theme of heroism often present the same narrative. There are three characters in the classical Western narrative structure: the hero, the villain, and the society. The narrative in the present story explains the struggle of a hero to save society from an oppressive villain. In the beginning, there is a balanced situation, but later something comes in, breaks the calm, creating an imbalance. In the end, however, everything gets sorted out and the situation gets under control. This important theme of heroism in the novel is presented by Mowgli, who saves the wolf pack from Sher Khan's oppression. Since the anime is a long project, Mowgli gets enough opportunities and time to live up to his heroic potential. This is in sharp contrast to Kipling, who focuses on Mowgli's success alone and removes all the aspects which problematize his depiction as a hero. While reading the original text, one imagines him as a muscular boy, but the anime portrays him as a skinny-legged. He joins effort with the wolf pack to battle against Sher Khan. The original text and Disney's famous animated movie mainly focused on rising and subsiding tensions between Mowgli, his jungle mates, and the villainous tiger Sher Khan, apart from Mowgli's survival in the society. But in the anime, which is a long 52-episode project, we see the writers using keen insight to build the character of Mowgli, his rootlessness in the jungle, and his alienation from both animals and human society. We see Mowgli's constant struggle to fit into the pack of wolves on the one hand, and his conflict with the bloodthirsty tiger in the jungle on the other. The amendments made to the cultural elements also make the story interesting and meaningful in a postmodern society. In the anime, when an infant Mowgli gets separated from his parents, Baloo the bear, Bagheera the panther, and Kaa the python rescue him from all possible perils. While Kaa is a villain in the novel and Disney film version, the anime presents this hypnotic creature as a parent figure from the beginning. Here we see a difference from the book and any other adaptations. Next, Kipling didn't give names to all the wolves, whereas all of them have been assigned names in the anime. In the anime, the old lupine leader, Akela, is killed by Sher Khan during the battle to protect Mowgli. But as per Kipling's Jungle Book, the assassination of Pack Supremo by his young wolves when his power have dwindled is a routine practice. Kipling's story concludes with the killing of Sher Khan. Mowgli had to leave his multicultural environment and go back to live in the human village where he came from. On the other hand, the anime ended on a hopeful note of acceptance when trust begins to bloom between the general populace of the jungle and the village. Kipling presents a duality of gender. Terrorizing with viciousness and butchering hundreds of beasts is more of an exhibition of so-called manliness. It has characters who possess rather feminine characteristics. Also, Mowgli's two best friends, Baloo and Bagheera, show multiple facets. Baloo is a big caring bear, while Bagheera, according to Kipling, has a voice as soft as wild honey dripping from a tree and a skin softer than dough. There is no significant feminine animal character in the Jungle Book aside from the mother wolf. But in the anime, she has not only been given the name Chameli, but also she has also been assigned the post of the pack's leader after the killing of Akela. This could be a positive symbol of the breaking up of gender hegemony. In the case of Japanese anime, dubbed in Hindi, three possible modes of relation can be discussed. Here, borrowing, intersecting, and fidelity of transformation. By borrowing, filmmakers hope to win the target audience by retaining the charm of the prestigious title or subject. The anime discussed here also retained the same title in Hindi as its popular subject of life and law of the jungle. By second mode, intersecting, we understand that to be dramatized, a novel has to be modified, reduced, or expanded in size, and controversial complexities should be eliminated. For example, the anime presents the idea of scaling down the darker tone of Western imperialism. By the mode of fidelity or transformation, we understand the task of adaptation here is to bring back the spirit of the text. In this case, an attempt has been made to intuit and reproduce the feeling of the novel by observing fidelity with the subject and through the transformation into a concrete visualization in terms of acting, dialogue, audiovisual effects, animation technology, etc. In the context of theories of adaptation of literary work into film, Hachon elaborates the phenomenon of adaptation into three distinct but interrelated perspectives to refer to the process and the production. First, adaptation as a formal entity is announced as it involves a shift of medium. Therefore, an adaptation must differ from original text while still retaining its fundamental ideas. Second, as a process of creation, the act of adaptation always involves reinterpretation and recreation. Thus, we may say that adaptation is the process of giving a new meaning to the concerned text. Third, seen from its point of view of reception, the adaptation is a form of intertextuality, which is seen as a palimpsest of other works that resonate through repetition and variation. Hachon affirms that a filmic adaptation must remain an exclusive piece of art and the possibility of modification in the content of the original work to fulfill the audience expectation. She adds, quote, as a product, adaptation cannot remain entirely faithful to its original text. Otherwise, the question of plagiarism may arise. Even so, the fundamental idea of the original work, which is adapted into film, relatively remains the same as it is portrayed in the literary work. Unquote. Thus, an adaptation of a literary work does not have to capture all the nuances of the book's complexity, but also introduce certain differences as part of developing the narrative of the literary work. Though the romantic affair between Mowgli and Radha is one of the important plottiness of the anime, we also see the odd interracial romantic hint between she-wolf Leela and Mowgli. But whether it is Radha or Leela, these experimental bold aspects can be seen neither in Kipling's version nor in the Disney adaptation. The anime is also supposed to be a statement of the social upheaval in Kipling's setting. Kipling's text is an epitome of hierarchy and patriarchy, out to prove that a society can't function unless everyone is in proper place. In the anime, the setting is composed as an introductory element with the notion of reinventing Kipling's archetypes for the modern age. For example, the portrayal of Sher Khan in the series symbolizes power and dominance over other animals. Additionally, the segregation done by the colonial system of people based on gender, race, and species is well depicted. However, the notion behind this hostile act is not apparent and hence not perceived by the tiny tot audience for whom this adaptation was purposely made. Foucault stresses that the author's function is historically determined and changes over time. Quote, the circulation, attribution, and appropriation modes of discourse vary with culture and are modified in each particular case. Unquote. Mowgli's jungle in the anime is for sure young Kipling's India, but not in the sense that Kipling perceived Indians as animals. The jungles and animals are a metaphor for another civilization with different rules, which Mowgli had lived and learned to understand despite being aware of belonging to another world. As long as screen adaptations exist, there also exists criticism against the intertextuality between literature and filmic representation. Leo Tolstoy considered film as a direct attack on literature, while Virginia Woolf described cinema as parasite and literature as its prey. However, recent trends in adaptation theory have moved far away from such dichotomization of film and literature, with a focus on multidimensional flows across the transmedia model. According to Walter Benjamin, adaptation, usually viewed as free translation, is an ambivalent activity that gives enough freedom to assure the afterlife of the original. The said anime can be considered better than the original or any other adaptation done so far, as this dwells deeper into the world of hero Mowgli and his kindred animals. From character changes to character cuttings, there are several modifications made from original Kipling text, which is darker and more sinister. It ensures that the protagonist ventured into the colorized spaces as a requirement of a technical aspect, but the recomposition of the animal classic into a much loved melodic visual presents a redemptive story of cheerfulness about the youth negotiating difficult times. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandal. That was a very interesting paper. We'll come back to the questions. And now I invite Sakshi Trihan, PhD candidate, Department of French and Francophone Studies, JNU, New Delhi, to make her presentation on translating cultural elements. Sakshi.
Yes, ma'am, I'm just trying to share my screen.
Yes.
Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, ma'am. Just a second. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sakshi Trihan, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD at the Center for French and Francophone Studies at JNU, New Delhi. Today, I'll be presenting my paper titled Translating Cultural Elements in Children's Literature, Challenges and Strategies. I'll start by giving a brief introduction to literary translation in children's literature. Then I will talk about the selected short stories for this study as well as their authors. I will then talk about the various challenges that came up during the process of translation, and I will finally conclude my presentation by once again stating the hypothesis and how it's been proven. Translation is an act of transferring linguistic elements from one language to another, as well as the non-linguistic elements. This means that words, thoughts, expressions, and cultural ideas must be conveyed in the target language in the same way as they were originally written in the source language. It's important for a translator to focus on each of these aspects in literary translation. As we all know, literary translation has helped people discover new cultures for many centuries, whether it's by poetry, epics, fiction, or even non-fiction. All of these can serve as gateways to culture. However, with translating literature from other cultures, we have a particular set of challenges. In this paper, I focus on children's literature from India. The genre is different from other literary genres in terms of language, readership, or even themes, and it is written and translated in a different way than other genres as well. I've translated 2 short stories that were originally written in English by Indian authors, and I've translated them into French. Both short stories are by reputed Indian writers and have a simple plot that can be easily understood by young readers. They deal with problems that are often experienced in childhood, and the language and the setting of these particular stories are typically Indian. The main readership of children's literature is children and young adults. However, sorry. However, there are certain characteristics that are specific to the genre. I cite here, children's stories are generally shorter. They tend to favor an active rather than a passive treatment, with dialogue and incident rather than description and introspection. Child protagonists are the rule. Conventions are much used. They tend to be optimistic rather than depressive. Language is child-oriented. Plots are of a distinctive order. Probability is often discarded. So this body of literature includes a wide range of stories, whether it's fairy tales, historical narratives, illustrated books, short stories related to religion and morality, folklore, etc. And it is usually written keeping in mind that it will be read by children, though the language is usually not very complex. There are usually no deep images or symbols for a child to deconstruct. Instead, the authors focus on having simple narratives that a child can relate to and maybe learn from. Over the years, educators and parents have realized that reading plays an important role for children in terms of improving cognitive skills, discovering new cultures, learning new words, and even stimulating creativity. So today, we can even say that children's literature has 2 kinds of readership. It addresses 2 audiences, and I cite here. Books of this kind address 2 audiences: children who want to be entertained and possibly informed, and adults who have quite different tastes and literary expectations. The latter group, which comprises in the first instance editors and publishers, and subsequently parents, educators, academics, and critics, is clearly much more influential than the former. I will now discuss some important aspects of children's literature. Most books written for children have a simple story. There is no plethora of characters that could overwhelm a reader. The story takes place in a handful of settings, usually with a linear timeline, and the main idea is presented clearly and concisely. These stories use engaging language filled with repetition, onomatopoeic words, and vocabulary that is used by children in their daily lives. These stories can also have a moral or a lesson that is conveyed to the readers, and it is usually related to positive values that most adults do try to instill in children. In general, children's literature uses children themselves as protagonists, and the main attempt at hand is to create characters that children can relate to, and the worlds presented in these stories are usually a reflection of the world through the eyes of a child. Unlike literature for adults, the action that takes place in children's short stories is very fast-paced. There's not always a main plot and multiple subplots. There usually is a very transparent plot, which is fast-paced to ensure that a child remains engaged. While this kind of literature is regularly subject to many changes, there are some elements, such as the ones I mentioned, that are more or less constant in most works of children's literature. However, some peculiarities can be observed in books in this field that differ from country to country. The two short stories that I've selected for this study are written by Sudha Murthy and R.K. Narayan respectively. Sudha Murthy is a writer whose stories have become extremely popular in the last 15 years, and she's published short stories in English as well as Kannada. And most of her short stories are for children. They're partly autobiographical and inspired by real life experiences. R.K. Narayan is one of the pillars of Indian literature in English, and he focuses on the everyday experiences of life that one can relate to. And his stories deal with family relationships, but also with the typical experiences of young Indian students. Both of these stories deal with themes that children can easily identify with, such as overbearing parents, the pressures of studying, an overworked father who has no time for his children. And these short stories, Doing What You Like is Freedom by Sudha Murthy and 45 a Month by R.K. Narayan, are grouped in the genre of Indian writing in English. So what is common here is the language that is used. The Indian English used in these texts is filled with words and phrases that are derived from the regional languages of India. And the multiple references to Indian culture and society. And of course, the target audience is young Indian readers. My goal has been to create translations that can be understood and appreciated by young French-speaking readers, and I believe that it is necessary to retain some aspects of the source language to avoid losing the local color of the original text at the same time. And the main obstacle in the act of translating children's literature that falls under Indian writing in English is the presence of cultural elements. Therefore, my paper argues that in order to create translations that can be appreciated by the French readership and do justice to the original Indian English works, it is necessary to conserve certain aspects of the source language, which is Indian English, as well as the cultural references. This leads me to the hypothesis that translating a literary text in the domain of children's literature written by an Indian writer poses a challenge for the translator on the level of language as well as culture. And the translator needs to employ certain strategies in order to be understood by young French readers. Translating children's literature comes with a series of challenges. We cannot translate it in the same way that one would translate literary works for adults. And this is evident given that most classics that have been translated from other languages have two versions, one for adults and one for children. It is important to keep in mind that children have a different level of understanding than adult readers, and therefore a translator needs to make a conscious effort to create a translated work which is more suitable for children's tastes in terms of the vocabulary used, the rhythm, the imagery that is weaved through the words, all while ensuring that we stick to the original author's intentions. Taking all of these factors into consideration, I will now examine the challenges that I faced during the translation process of the two short stories that I chose and the strategies I've adopted to overcome them. As my goal was to stay true to the central idea of the two texts, word-for-word translation was not the best option. And instead, I focused on translating ideas, feelings, and concepts in a way that should feel natural to readers of the target language, which is French. The objective is to evoke the same reactions in the target readers as those felt by the readers in the source language. Some of these challenges are linguistic, while others concern elements related to culture and society. So first, we have proper names. In translating the two stories, I decided to keep the original Indian names such as Shanta, Rao, Sharad, because I wanted to remind readers that they're reading literature from a different culture and society than their own. However, I have made slight changes to the spelling of some names to make it easier for children to read, which I have transliterated to French. The only objective of this transliteration is to make sure that the children do not have difficulties pronouncing the names, as these names are, of course, alien to them. I also had to keep in mind that using very complicated words or expressions or idioms was not an option because young readers are not necessarily always well versed with the nuances of a language. And I had to choose the simplest possible translation rather than flowery language. So, for instance, there's a sentence in the original text which says Venkat Rao's heart bled, which I translated in a different way in French to essentially mean that Venkat Rao was distraught or Venkat Rao was very sad, but I couldn't create an image in the exact same way that was written by the original writer. I also had to change the given that there are two kinds of past tense that are normally used in literature in French, I had to select two different tenses to express the chronology of the original stories. And most of the literary texts in French do use simple past tense, but I had to use another past tense also to translate the dialogues that take place between the characters. And given that each language has its own tone and rhythm, it's important to conserve these factors in translation. Given that I was working with two languages that come from completely different cultures, there were not exact equivalents for some words in the other language. And given that I want my translation to serve as an entrance to a whole new culture for young foreign readers, it was important for me to make sure that I retain the cultural references, allusions, and words, even if they are brand new to these readers. I cite here, the earlier in life young children are exposed to one or several foreign cultures, the more open-minded they will be later on. And it is also very interesting for children to read about people their own age who have had fun experiences in other parts of the world. I cite again, take the children out of themselves into entirely new worlds and let them find their children exactly like themselves. So during my translation, I've tried to retain the cultural markers used by the original authors. And my effort was to create a word that is distinctly Indian and that can offer a whole new experience to a French reader. So in my translation, I've also retained some words that are terms of endearment or words that are references to Indian food products, and I've refrained from replacing these terms with their approximate equivalents in French. So, for instance, in one of the stories, we find the term Shantabai, and in India, we know that Bai can be a suffix used to address a girl or a woman, and in the context of the story, it is how a teacher refers her student. So I used the same word in my translation to give the story some, to make sure that the story retained its local flavor. And I added the explanation of the meaning of this word in a footnote so that French readers can learn that this is something, this is a cultural marker from India. Similarly, there are references to Indian food such as chapati, which might not be a food product that young French readers already know of. And it wouldn't make sense to translate it simply to bread because that would just kind of erase the Indian concept that the authors are trying to create here. And again, I had to use a footnote here to facilitate understanding. Then we have a reference to a vermilion mark, which is putting a vermilion mark on someone's forehead is a cultural or religious ritual in India that is quite common. And given that it's a good omen, we follow this tradition quite commonly. And again, we might not have a similar ritual in France, but I wanted to keep my translation as close as possible to the source text. So I held on to this expression and made sure that a young French reader would learn about this custom or ritual. When it comes to idiomatic expressions, there is an idiom used in one of the stories which says, if they started any old tricks of theirs, which I had to translate in an entirely different way. And I had to simplify it a little because the result, had I translated it literally, it would not have made sense to a French speaking audience. And I had to replace it in my translation with a simpler way of saying the same thing so that young readers could understand. I also had to do the same thing with another idiom, which a sentence that was Venkat Rao's heart bled. And again, I had to opt out of literally translating the sentence because it would have sounded very odd. And I had to use a simpler word, which in French is des empares. So the question of accuracy in translation is important, and how much freedom can a translator exercise when translating a text, or can we make changes just to facilitate understanding, or do we religiously follow every word and sentence written by the author? And in children's literature, how far can we domesticate a text? So all of these questions are relevant in the translation process, and the most important aspect is to stay true to the essence of the text. As long as the translator focuses on the central idea created by the author in the source language, he or she will have a valid translation. It's important to keep the humor, rhythm, and tone of the original text, but we need to remember at every stance that this is going to be read by very young French readers. And in my translation, I have stayed true to the original text to maintain the same tone and writing style, but I've also used equivalents in places where it was acceptable to simplify understanding for the target audience. While children's literature is often quite simple to understand, translating it is definitely not child's play. The vocabulary might not be very complex, there might not be many detailed plots, but we need to make sure that the message in the original story is retained and is driven across as clearly to the foreign audience as well. And any translator faces various challenges while translating this genre, such as cultural differences, differences in syntax, differences in at a linguistic level. And I have discussed all of the problems that I faced in my translation, and I also highlighted why I chose to change the spelling of some proper names and how I retained or tried my best to retain the Indian flavor of the short stories in order to create the same image for the target readers. So during this study, I found that indeed translating a literary text is a challenge, especially in terms of culture. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Sakshi. That was a very good paper. The next paper we'll get to hear is Understanding the Translations of Betal Katha in the Chandamama Children's Magazine, a case of translation as rewriting. This is a presentation by Ayan Ghosh, PhD research scholar, Department of Comparative Indian Language and Literature, University of Calcutta.
Ma'am, Ayan Ghosh is absent.
Absent?
Yeah, he's not presenting his paper today.
Okay, all right. So let's get into the questions then. I understand Dr. Tarakeshwar is available. And questions can be raised by the audience here. The floor is open for questions.
There are questions in the chat box. You can take it up.
Oh, I see.
Abhijit.
Abhijit.
Okay. So Taresh is asking to Sakshi, can you at all lose all the nuances of source language / culture when you translate a text? If yes, can it still be called as a translation?
Yeah, I think there are certain phrases, or given that I work with English and French, and in this context, I worked with Indian English and French, there can be cases where you might not be able to find an exact equivalent at all, simply because that concept may not exist in France, right? So when we come across something like this, you can make the use of footnotes, you can put maybe a glossary at the beginning or the end of your text, but you might have to deal with it differently instead of finding the closest equivalent. And yes, I think it can still be called a translation as long as you get the message across, whether it's with the usage of a simple footnote at the bottom of a page or via a glossary. But definitely, I think there can be instances where it can be close to impossible to translate a nuance of a particular language.
Can I ask you something, Sandal? You made a very significant, important point, saying that the way Jungle Book has been adapted into English and into the movie that they made, anime that you call, and say that it has been kind of appropriated into the kind of the colonizer kind of narrative. Do you think it is a deliberate attempt, or could it have been avoided?
Thank you, ma'am, so much for your question. In fact, somewhere in my mind, I had the same question that it could be asked. Actually, what happened, we can say, yes, it is indeed a literary piece meant for children, and there is a particular message of a kind, like for example, catch them young. It means it is very easy to capture young minds because the young minds are very receptive. But at the same time, we should not forget that Rudyard Kipling was born in a staunch pro-imperialist family. In fact, the book was written by his father, entitled Man and Beast in India, was a sort of justification of imperialist hold over India and other countries of the time. So the people who were coming here to colonize, we can say civilize the people here in Caribbean or India, whatsoever. So it could have been avoided, but the people of that time, they those who were coming here in order to give them their certain message to, especially to the British kids who were already in Britain. So the purpose was mainly that through the target audience were the children and their parents as well. But the purpose was already made that through the children's literature, this message of colonial power should be reached to that particular segment of audience. Thank you.
Okay. But then how possible or impossible is it to be very close to the general, to the original, in terms of these cultural clashes, colonial clashes, geopolitical clashes? How genuine can translations really be?
Could you elaborate this question a little bit?
It's a continuation of the first question in many ways. Just as we have the post-colonial agenda or the colonial agenda, then if you're catering to the agendas, then how genuine can translations really be? Can we take it as, you know, a genuine translation of something, or we should always look in between the lines?
My intention for the study of this paper was not basically on the translation of literal translation, but on the adaptation, and especially this anime series of made by Japanese. So we really don't know what kind of response that it was received in Japan, but we can say that in order to stick to the, you know, be faithful to the original text, certain notions of Kipling's were kept, like the base of the jungle or the hierarchy in the jungle, law of the jungle. But there were certain elements which appealed to Indian audience, like particularly which was dubbed in Hindi, especially like the Nana Patekar's voice modules, intonations of other characters, and this opening song Jungle Jungle Baat Chaliye by penned by Gulzar. So it certainly yes appeal to the younger generation of this postmodern world. But if we see on the other hand the Disney's version, which was released in 2016 and I think in 2019, they are not animated movies. They are just like normal movies with sinister scenes, with sinister looks. So I feel every mode has its own, every medium of presentation has its own requirement, and producer has to be extremely careful about choosing the suitable mode for adaptation into a novel. So this is what I can say about it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, Abhijit, any more questions on the chat box? Abhijit?
Usha, you can ask the question.
Okay, so I don't have a question as much as I have an observation about this paper on the Jungle Book. Now, first of all, the Jungle Book had been adapted multiple times before the beginning of the anime and before anybody had ever come across the term anime, right? And I don't understand how it fits in the idea of translation. And I also felt that there should be a little bit more of an elaboration on Kipling's position as a as a colonizer or as a pro-colonial individual. to justify the placing of Jungle Book as a colonizing text, right? Because I couldn't understand how Ms. Bharadwaj is trying to say that, it is a colonizing text only because Kipling's family was located in India and that they were staunchly colonial. This would assume that, people just follow what their families follow, and that people do not.
May I for this?
Sandal, yeah, in continuation with what Usha has said, yeah, I was thinking maybe could you give some examples of what your argument is, right?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, I mentioned that Kipling was born in a staunch pro-imperialist family. But before Jungle Book, his another novel, Rukh, was published. And more or less, there was a very clear-cut kind of indication of imperialism was there, like hierarchy, dichotomy of people. And after that, Kim, where Mowgli was also the protagonist of that story. And at the very end of that era, Kipling wrote his poem, White Man's Burden. So we really don't know. Even Kipling never said that he was upholding the system of imperialism. Though the idea of white man's burden, he did precisely the same thing. I can say only about this.
No, based on the text, based on a comparative study of this text, can you give some examples? Not because he belonged to a particular family or.
No, I said in these adaptations, whether it is Disney's adaptation, which was, as Madam Usha said, the first adaptation was Disney in 1967, when one Indian actor was named Sabu was there. And then in fact, there was one more film. And then in 1989, this anime was released, which was a kind of animation film. So my thesis on this is that in these versions, whether it is Disney version or it is Japan's anime series, this kind of notion, the imperialism, colonialism, is being purposely avoided. This ethnocentric parallel is avoided because it should not convey the message of colonial subjugation to the young children of this era. It's not mentioned there. One can understand the hierarchy is there, the patriarchy is there, but this notion is purposely avoided.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr.
Ma'am, may I
go ahead? Do you want to ask any more questions?
Ma'am, may I go ahead?
Yes, Nina.
Yes. I have been listening to the various viewpoints that have been expressed here. And finally, I just would like to pick on the last few sentences that I just heard, and just open up an avenue for further thought, not to, expand on this discussion further.
Understand.
I would just like to point out that when we talk of Japanese anime, or when we talk of the Disney adaptations, not just of the Jungle Book, but various other classics of children's literature, whether they come from Europe, like Hans Christian Andersen, or written by a British person during the colonial era, like Kipling, or even maybe a more modern story written by an Indian. I'm not going to name names over here, but would it be, I find it just a little bit too simplistic to put down the reason for the way Disney has adapted these, let us say, written works onto screen. The reason as to avoid an imperialistic tone, or to, let us say, avoid sending out that kind of message to the next generation. I find that this is a kind of maybe a problematic statement, because I feel that the aspect of globalization, the fact that the audience, the intended audience of these and adaptations into cartoons or anime transcends national boundaries, linguistic boundaries, and geopolitical boundaries as well. So I do not know whether the intention is to avoid a imperialistic tone, or it is just a outcome of a commercial, let us say, factor of production. So I feel that when you make a statement that it is in order to avoid an imperialistic tone, you should defend your statement with also by also mentioning these other commercial as well as the role globalization has to play in the world economy. When you talk of animation, is a world industry today that transcends boundaries. So to avoid that, or defend your idea by also mentioning this and then providing more details and examples. That is my only suggestion.
Thank you, Nina, for your thought. Actually, in the paper itself, I have mentioned that there can be market necessity also for that. But as we know that Americans fought an anti-colonial war in between 1776 and 1783 at the very end of the 18th century against Britain. So it's my point of view that hence they understood the agonies of the colonial people. They tried to avoid this kind of incorporation of this notions into their works, because yes, of course, it should be pertinent to the market, it should be pertinent to the audience, not only children but also the adults. At least the message should be very clear and without any colonial feeling. That's what I can say about it. Thank you.
Because the factors cannot be limited. The factors that imprint upon how you adapt something and are way too many to count, and they overlap also. So it's a very mysterious labyrinth that we need to enter, that we enter but we cannot get out of. So it's globalization, it's geopolitical, it's everything. So we cannot have a clear cut explanation of how a translation has been, has managed to be this or that, or, there cannot be, I think.
And I also feel that giving the American Revolution and decolonization from the British as a rationale is a bit tricky. Or I think you may, kind of get stuck in quicksand over there, intellectual quicksand, because from another perspective, it may be argued that the American Revolution only provided a change of government, but the factors such as racism or discrimination based on color and ethnicity did not change at all in the Americas at that time, as we see from what happened to the Native Americans, the African Americans post the American Revolution. So again, I feel you may be on dangerous ground with that argument if you do not support it sufficiently with other arguments. Thank you.
I completely agree with Dr. Gogate about this. I mean, saying that Americans are post-colonials because they fought a post-colonial war is stretching it a little, because the people who fought that war had come with the British king's diktat to colonize the land, right? The descendants of the people who fought that war came with a diktat to colonize the land, and they completely erased the Native Americans. Yeah, so saying that they are post-colonials and therefore carry a post-colonial sensibility, I think is stretching it a little too much. So anyway,
I think yes, that can be corrected a bit. Yes, that's right. Sandal, right? Yeah.
Yes, of course.
In fact, it takes me to the next participant's Do we have more questions on this, Abhijit? Or can we move on to Sakshi?
Chat box, there is no question.
Okay.
Anyone willing to ask any question, please?
Any more questions to Sandal? Dr. Kokila? Because if we look at Sakshi Trihan's paper, where she has translated Indian stories into French, then what comes to my, the thought that comes to me is then the dominance of the language. Is there also dominance of the language that plays a role in translation? You know, certain languages are, you know, supposed to be, you know, more, you know, kind of like how we compare Indian languages with English. So when you compare Indian languages with French, would that play again all the kind of factors that we discussed just now with relation to Sandal's paper? What would Sakshi Trahan say about that?
I worked with Indian English into French. I haven't really worked with translating any Indian language into French. I mean, it's just Indian English.
Yes. So did you notice yourself refining too much in French or using a very different kind of French, romanticizing the language kind of thing?
I tried my best to stick as
becoming more beautiful.
I don't think so. I don't think it was more beautiful. No, not for me, maybe. But I try to stay as close to the original texts that were in Indian English, and I try to retain all the cultural markers that I could. And I didn't want to domesticate it too much either, because like I repeatedly said, I wanted the text to retain this Indian-ness, because that is very, very evident in the Indian English used by both authors. So that's what I tried to do.
To what extent is that Indianness carried over to the adaptation or the translation?
To a large extent, because for instance, like so Sudha Murthy uses words like, she uses words that are from Kannada, for example, or like R.K. Narayan has used a Tamil word, okay, and he himself has put it in italics in the original text. So I put the same thing in italics and I explain it in a footnote in the bottom. So jutka, for instance, is a word that he used, which means like a cart or a chariot. So I could have just translated that to the word for chariot in French, but I didn't want to do that because that wasn't the intention of the author. So I retained the whole thing in italics. And
this reminds me of Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things, where she uses a lot of, words like mole and all, mole girl. And then she does a lot of glossing for the Malayalam words that she uses, Tharavar and mole and things like that. And critics have pointed out that she is writing for a particular audience. And where is she writing? For the Indian audience, she has a particular audience in mind already. And so how would you answer that question if you are, glossing, you're giving the meaning? So you have an audience in mind.
So for instance, if we talk about Sudha Murthy's story, if you look at the language that she uses, it's very much like the language that we use in our daily lives. So it's a very Indianized English. So syntax wise, it's something that we are used to as Indians, but even for a British or American reader, they might think that English is not standard English, right? So I would say that I think she has just tried to write it in a way where we would actually speak. So her target audience is young Indian readers, right? So she's tried to use the language just like how she would speak it. It's not very classic language. It's not very literary or flowery language. It's just very to the point. So what I have tried is to make sure that the French that I use is also very clear. Because again, like the target audience is kids. So I can't make it too complex, and I have tried to stick to her way of writing.
Okay, any more questions to Sakshi? Even then, I would be interested in knowing who the target readers are. Target readers from India who know French, or is it for the French audiences?
The whole idea of me translating this was, I think Sudhamurti's and authors become very popular in India, and especially in the domain of children's literature. So the translation that I was trying to create was maybe young French readers in France or Francophone countries. That is what I thought.
Okay, good. Abhijit, any questions in the chat box?
No, ma'am.
Okay.
Sir is
Dr.
is
Tarak
in, yeah.
is here.
Hmm.
Tarakeshwar sir, any questions?
Shall I?
Yes.
Yeah, Sakshi, I think your presentation was too good and too neat. So maybe I am not commenting on your translation, it might have come out well. Neither I am commenting on your choice of text, but the framework in which you are trying to understand your own translation, I think is too neat. There are no rough patches. There are no rough patches. There are nothing that spurs me in that sense. It has a neat division of categories. This is the cultural problem. These are the issues. These are the issues. There's no doubt in your mind about what you are doing and why you are doing. So everything is neatly packed, planned, and everything is working according to the thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's good to know that, but I don't think that would be the case. You need to look for the rough patches and then hit upon that. Then you will find something else. So don't go for the ready-made framework that are available to understand the translations in terms of cultural problems, linguistic problems, foreignization, the domestication. Look for the rough patches, hit on that. Then you will hit a jackpot. So I am trying to push you out of your comfort zone.
Yes, sir.
It's not a comment on the translation because I have not looked at your translation. So in a sense, it might have come out well. So it's only a comment on the way you are trying to understand your own exercise.
Okay.
And the framework that you are using it for it.
Okay. Yes, sir. I appreciate the feedback, sir. Thank you. And I will definitely try to look at it from that way.
Okay, Dr. Kokila, any questions? Nina, Kokila, yes, Kokila.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any questions, Nina?
Hello.
Any questions for Sakshi or Sundar?
Actually, ma'am, yeah.
Any observations?
Ma'am, actually, I was disconnected for a couple of minutes. So,
okay, no problem.
Yes, I have a question for Sakshi, but if it is a repetition of somebody else's point, then it's disregard since I was disconnected due to office call for a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Sakshi, first of all, I like the way you have gone about in a very systematic manner to explain how you are translating children's literature into French from Indian English. I just have a query for you. Like, because you this is a topic I think you're doing for your PhD, that if the strategies that you employ today for translating children's fiction into another language, especially as you said from where there is a large cultural difference, at that time, do you think the very experience of childhood, the way it has for 50 years, translating children's literature in the 60s or the 70s, or right now today in 22, would you think that the strategies that you would use for translating the text would change depending on how children experience childhood or the world around them? Means if we contrast, diachronically over a period of time. So do you think translation strategies also depend on this aspect? And if they do, in what way do they depend on this aspect?
I missed one part of your question. I think your voice got cut. Can you just repeat it, please?
Yes, I'll just repeat it.
Actually, your voice is still getting
talked in
cut,
great
Leena.
detail about the various linguistic. Oh, okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Is it audible now? Yeah. I'll just like resume the question. I'll shorten it and I'll just ask you that if you look at the way translations of children's fiction have been carried out over a long period of time, let us say from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or today, then do you think the way children experience childhood today, or maybe 50 years back or 70 years back, that itself would be an important factor in determining the kind of strategies you would use to translate from one language to another where there is a great difference of culture? And if so, then what kind of difference would you find in the strategies? If have you thought about this point before? If you have, then I would like to hear about it. Yeah.
I've not really thought about it right now, but maybe I can get back to you.
No. Please do see my question was in the form of a comment because you are doing a PhD and you have a lot of opportunity, to deepen your research. That was all, nothing else. Thank you. Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I would like to, just add to what uh, who has said now, just now. Like the strategies, the how the translation strategies have changed over a period of time, especially the adaptation. Like, are they going more towards foreignization or more towards domestication? Like if you look at Harry Potter, which is being translated, or earlier what the text which we were translating, like for Jungle Book, maybe it was adapted or animated maybe in the 80s or so. So how that was done and how things are done now. So that could be a comparative study which will help us know about the strategies of translation which are being adopted.
Absolutely, ma'am. I agree with you.
Yeah. Initially, that is my general observation. Perhaps it may not be true. Like initially, we were into translate more of an adapting to Indian context. The names would be changed and the context would be changed. Everything would be changed. But now, over a period of time, the translations have been more of a like foreignizing. We are retaining, especially if you look at the cartoon films. No, children are more attracted towards the cartoon films. Like I don't get the names now. Which are there, the cartoon films, right? Doraemon or such things, right? Children, yeah.
Yes.
Earlier we didn't have this kind of foreign or any other cartoon films, and we were naturally not of course I was not that young, but when we were in school days and all, we didn't have this. We had only Tom and Jerry and all Disney kind of things. So not this kind of, and especially now they are dubbed also in regional languages, not only in Hindi. You find Doraemon in Telugu and other. I'm sure they must be there in other Indian languages as well. And children are attracted towards this kind of foreign cartoon films. So these things need to be explored, I feel. That is only, my...
Yes, ma'am. I totally agree with you that I feel that in the past, translation strategies in children's fiction would concentrate more on the pedagogical aspect, or rather, I would call it translation of effect rather than affect in this situation. But today, intercultural education, I think, has become an integral part of any child, let us say the experience of childhood through technology, also through the parents' aspirations, due to various factors. And therefore, I find that this is a very fertile ground in which translation of children's fiction, the target would not be rather to communicate the same kind of message or the moral or have a similar effect on the child in another culture, but rather to impart knowledge and awareness about a different culture itself. So I feel that the focus, let us say, or the main message that is being communicated when children's text travels from one region to another could change, but could that would not diminish the value of that text, I feel. So as you said.
Yeah, in continuation of Kokila's observation, I would say the line between the original and the translation, or translation made available through subtitles and all, the Netflix is full of it, be it Korean, be it Spanish. Look at how popular all the Korean stuff is on Netflix.
That is what, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's more popular than even the English counterparts, right? So I think translation is no more kind of, like someone said, very fertile ground, and it has to be really explored. And I think it's the way to go now. It's time for translations have arrived finally. And it's good. It's good.
Yeah, and another point is like language is not a barrier at all. Whether
Yes.
they are able to understand, visuals play a major role. So only when they want to listen to what the dialogue is, they would stop and see, or they would just concentrate. So they're more interested into the visual effects and all. So perhaps language is not at all a barrier, and they would understand. Somehow they would understand, I think, by using the visual effects.
Yes.
Here I would like to add a point what Kokila madam said just now. Like I totally agree with her that it is because of the receptivity. Like the visual adaptation has been a success because it has to do with the capacity of various sense organs. In case of a novel, suppose it is a mind that inner sense organs perceive the depicted scenes, and this exercises a load upon the brain, where in contrast a person feels no such compulsion in case of viewing a film. It is because eye account for 85% share of perception and ears account for another 12%. So in total 97 perception of needs while exercising, it is not a load upon the brain.
Sandal has got all the data. Very good, Sandal.
Thank you.
So any more questions?
Yeah, shall I come in now?
Yes, please, Dr. Tarakeshwar.
One is I would suggest that we need to rethink about this category called children's literature itself. Because Panchatantra, we never looked at it as children's literature because that category doesn't exist in the Indian tradition.
Exactly.
Panchatantra becomes a children's literature only now. Even today, stories from Panchatantra is narrated to talk about politics.
Yes.
In fact, it was used to teach politics at that point of time.
Yes.
So in that sense, this idea of childhood itself is a romantic notion which has come into existence in the last 200, 300 years. Earlier, this neat division that we today make between adult and children, that never existed. We grew up as adult, or we were children until the end. And now, in the last 100 years, especially through pedagogical institutions, we have typecast this category called child and then adult. So when we are thinking in terms of children's literature, translation of children's literatures, it's also important to problematize the category of children's literature itself. So that would be one suggestion. And the second, I think the discussion went in a right direction at the end, where we were moving towards not looking at the just the translation, but what is happening to the medium itself. So it is also tied up with the question that somebody raised in the YouTube streaming. about adaptation, because in the last session we were discussing about adaptation as opposed to translation. But the question there was about, isn't it adaptation when it changes the genre, when the novel is made into a anima or a animated cartoon or something like that. So the medium itself alters certain things. So I'm not saying that it is completely free of ideological and political politics, but in spite of that, the medium also plays a major role. And translation nowadays is looking at not just simply at a translation of linguistic text, but also looking at the translation of multimedia text. So in that sense, it's not something new also again. If we go back, most of the Ramayana stories and the Mahabharata stories are known to you through the folk performances and through sculpture, through painting. So in that sense, this kind of multimedia translation movement across genre was evident even earlier. I think now we are going back to that kind of time where we don't solely rely on the language, or the definition of language itself has to change in that sense. So I think the discussion went on in a direction. I think I can see one more hand being raised. I'll stop here.
Sorry, although the session is coming to an end, and with the permission of the chair, may I just say what I wanted to say?
Yes.
This is the moment where I'm missing in-person conferences, because if it were an in-person conference, I would have waited, and with tea, I would have tried to have a discussion with Dr. Tarakeshwar, who's an old friend, about this category called children's literature not existing. At the moment, I'm teaching a course called Written for Children and Young Adults. And this morning in my class, I had a discussion on the Panchatantra, and it was brought up by a student who asked me about the Panchatantra as children's literature. Right. And I told him that, well, it was written for children or composed for children, but these were a king's children. And it was, as Dr. Tarakeshwar rightly pointed out, for teaching politics. But it was, in fact, composed for people who were in training to become politicians or kings, and therefore were children of sorts. The category of how we look at the child and who the child is, I completely agree, changed and has been changing for centuries. Yeah, so we can't quite say that there is nothing like children's literature, though. So I would feel very scared if people said there is nothing like children's literature.
No,
So
I think what probably Professor Tarakeshwar tried to say is that we can call something maybe children's literature, but it need not stay or define itself as purely children's literature. You know, you take Jungle Book, it is children's literature, but then it is equally for adults. How much do adults get to learn from Jungle Book? Or you talk about Gulliver's Travels, or you talk about Robinson Crusoe. They are, you know, multidimensional. They are for children as well as adults. So that line is kind of now fading between children's literature and adult literature, if you want to call it that. But you cannot restrict something into being only children's literature, is what maybe he's trying to say.
That's true, Chinna.
Yeah, which is precisely why I wanted this conversation to happen one-to-one.
One thing, Usha. What Professor Tarakeshwar was saying was, maybe he was talking about Panchatantra especially. And if you say that Panchatantra is meant for children, like they were not children as such. Like, I mean, what is the category? What is the age? Till what time do you consider them as children, right? So they were quite, getting older, maybe somewhere in their teenagers, something of that sort, right? We don't know exactly what
we don't know, considering.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, we don't know,
Because
considering it was a 2,500-year-old text.
Points. such serious points which were discussed, or the message which was conveyed through the Panchatantra stories, right? Some of them at least.
Life lessons.
So
yeah,
they may not be
life
for children, if you consider them up to 5 years or 10 years. What is the age group? That
you
is
see,
the question, perhaps.
you see, I mean, that is what childhood studies is actually studying quite seriously in its own way, no? I mean, what is children's literature? What is the age when you would consider somebody a child? Is that age flexible? Is it not flexible? And all of that. So it is, I mean, I'm not saying that all I wanted to say, therefore I wanted this discussion to happen on the sidelines in the corridors with tea, because, you know, it can go on. So, but anyway, I'll try and have this conversation some other time. But thank you, ma'am, for giving me this opportunity to react, because, you know, being somebody who works in the field of childhood studies, mostly, I got very scared when there was this thought that came up that, you know, okay, there is nothing like children's literature. So, but anyway, thank you very much.
Everything will have a sense of flexibility. We live in a very flexible system now, and I think every definition has a flexibility to it. We cannot anymore, you know, hold on to watertight compartments. That's, I think, we can wind up on that thought.
Before you wind up, madam, with your permission.
People are scared now.
Tarakeshwar,
They are scared by your statements, huh? That there is nothing like children's literature, huh?
With your permission, one more
I was
statement.
always scared of Tarakeshwar's statements.
We will talk like that only. We will talk like that only. There's nothing like good or bad. There's nothing
Since
like.
morning, I was scared he would say something.
He is known for such statements. Huh?
Yes, I know.
Shocking you,
No,
right? Making you think. Yeah.
No, I did not say that there is nothing like children's literature. Problematize that concept, that category called children's literature. So problematizing the category doesn't mean that you need to throw it to the dustbin. That's the point that I was making. And the second point is on behalf of the department, that all of you are welcome to be in Department of Translation Studies, EFLU, whenever you feel like, or whenever we host a in-person event. So without that also, you're all of you are invited to be in the department for any discussion related to translation studies. All of you are, the invitation stands.
And tea will be served.
Thank you. Much needed. So yes, as I was saying, you know, after a very long time, I'm meeting Tarakeshwar, after a really very long time, more than 2 decades. So it would have been wonderful if that could have happened in his department and etc. Which is why I got onto this conference thinking that, you know, well, where else does one start with translation studies but in this department, which is doing really good work in translation studies, right? So thank you for giving me the scope to be here, even if it is virtually.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Ushaji. Thank you to both the paper presenters and the participants. So thank you, Dr. Tarakeshwar and Dr. Kokila. Thank you very much for the wonderful session.
Thank you, madam.
End
Thank
here.
you, organizers.
Thank you too. Thank you too.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. See you.
Thank you very much.
So before we conclude, on behalf of the Department of Translation Studies, EFLU, Hyderabad, I would like to thank Dr. S. Chinna Devi for chairing the session successfully on a very short notice. And I would like to thank Professor Lakshmi, Professor Tarakeshwar, Dr. Kokila ma'am, for providing me this opportunity to act as an compare for this session, and also for including this topic, children's literature and translation, in the seminar. I thank both the presenters for providing insights into the topic children's literature and translation, and I hope these papers would have enriched the existing knowledge base of the participants and will reinvigorate further debate and discussion on this topic. Also, I thank all the participants for joining us. I request all the participants to join us for tomorrow's session at 10 a.m. for some interesting presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abhijit.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chinnadevi. Thank you,
Dr.
Abhijit.
Dr.
Yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
So again, meet you, all of you, tomorrow morning.
yeah.
Yes.
We stay back, sir?
Yes.